For decades, the architects of these atrocities walked untouched among us, hiding their monstrous secrets in crime scene archives far too visceral for this platform to fully display. Yet, even through the carefully filtered fragments we are permitted to examine today, the sudden unraveling of these 40-year cold cases proves that the darkest truths cannot stay buried forever. In the mid to late 1970s, the sprawling suburban neighborhoods of California represented the quintessential American dream, characterized by manicured lawns, unlocked doors, and a pervasive sense of profound security among the growing middle class. Families flocked to the quiet, sun-drenched communities of Sacramento and its surrounding areas, seeking a peaceful environment to raise their children far removed from the urban decay and rising crime rates of major metropolitan centers. The residents of these idyllic subdivisions lived their lives with a trusting innocence, frequently leaving windows open to catch the evening breeze and rarely giving a second thought to the shadows cast by the dense foliage lining their peaceful streets. It was an era largely defined by neighborhood barbecues, children playing outside until the streetlights illuminated the cul-de-sacs, and a general collective belief that their enclaves were entirely insulated from the horrific violence that frequently dominated the evening news broadcasts. However, this comforting illusion of safety was entirely predicated on a fragile foundation that was completely unequipped to withstand the sudden, systematic intrusion of a highly organized predator who studied their habits with meticulous obsession. The homes that were meant to be impenetrable sanctuaries were, in reality, highly vulnerable targets for someone who understood the architectural layout of the new suburban developments far better than the unsuspecting residents themselves. People went to sleep each night entirely unaware that an unseen observer had spent countless hours memorizing their daily schedules, identifying the most accessible entry points, and quietly dismantling the subtle psychological barriers that separated the public street from their private bedrooms. The victims of the impending terror were entirely ordinary individuals, young couples, single women, and teenagers, whose only fatal mistake was living in a quiet community that had been carefully selected as a hunting ground by a phantom. As the seasons changed and the nights grew increasingly longer, an insidious presence began to weave itself into the very fabric of these neighborhoods, preparing to unleash a reign of terror that would forever alter the psychological landscape of the entire state. The foundational bedrock of suburban tranquility was about to be violently shattered, permanently replaced by a suffocating paranoia that would endure for generations as the community slowly realized a monster was freely walking among them. The tipping point from a lingering sense of unease to outright localized panic occurred when a series of bizarre, highly organized home invasions began to plague the Sacramento area, fundamentally shifting the paradigm of typical residential burglaries. Initially dismissed as a string of peculiar break-ins where the intruder focused on seemingly trivial personal items while ignoring valuable electronics, the crimes rapidly escalated in both frequency and profound psychological violence, introducing the region to the terrifying entity dubbed the East Area Rapist. Law enforcement swiftly realized they were not dealing with a transient thief, but rather a methodical sadist who deliberately woke his victims from their sleep by blinding them with a powerful flashlight, fully armed and terrifyingly calm. The sheer brazenness of his methods, forcing husbands to remain bound with a stack of heavy dishes balanced precariously on their backs, while threatening to slaughter everyone if a single plate rattled, indicated a perpetrator who thrived on absolute dominance and meticulous psychological torture. Panic swept through the state like a destructive wildfire as the horrific attacks multiplied, prompting hardware stores to completely sell out of deadbolts, window locks, and guard dogs as terrified citizens desperately fortified their homes against an invisible enemy. The collective terror was exponentially compounded when investigators discovered that the perpetrator was preemptively entering targeted homes days before the actual attack to unlock specific windows, unload defensive firearms, and strategically hide shoelaces beneath sofa cushions to be utilized later as physical restraints. The geographic scope of the nightmare continually expanded as the attacker seamlessly moved from Northern California down to the southern regions of the state, transitioning from horrific sexual assaults to brutal, cold-blooded murders in affluent communities like Goleta, Ventura, and Irvine. The eventual forensic realization that the East Area Rapist and the original Night Stalker were the exact same biological individual forced authorities to confront the staggering reality that a single, unstoppable phantom had successfully terrorized the entire western seaboard without leaving a single actionable clue. Every time the heavily armed task forces believed they had established a viable perimeter or anticipated his next strategic move, the killer effortlessly adapted, vanishing into the night and leaving behind a tragic trail of shattered lives and profoundly bewildered investigators. This pivotal realization that traditional law enforcement methodologies were entirely inadequate against such a disciplined ghost-like adversary marked the grim beginning of a 40-year investigative stalemate that would fiercely haunt the memories of every single detective assigned to the case. As the years slowly bled into decades, the investigation morphed into one of the most exhaustive, frustrating, and labyrinthine manhunts in the entire history of American criminal justice, generating tens of thousands of pages of detailed case files that ultimately led to dead ends. Task forces across multiple, entirely disparate jurisdictions attempted to pool their vastly limited resources, meticulously cataloging the killer's distinct characteristics. From his unusually small shoe size to his precise, almost military-style application of specialized diamond knots used to ruthlessly bind his victims. Despite possessing dozens of composite sketches, thousands of highly detailed suspect tips, and even chillingly recorded phone calls where the killer sadistically taunted his surviving victims with heavy breathing and whispered threats of returning, the man's true identity remained entirely obscured by the relentless passage of time. Detectives exhausted thousands of promising leads, relentlessly interviewing known localized offenders, conducting extensive neighborhood canvasses, and ruling out countless suspects, yet the perpetrator's uncanny ability to consistently evade detection strongly suggested someone who possessed an intimate, insider knowledge of police procedures and tactical operations. The advent of modern forensic DNA profiling in the early 2000s provided a fleeting moment of monumental hope when scientists definitively linked the Northern Rape series to the Southern murder cases, irrevocably confirming the sheer, unprecedented magnitude of the killer's geographic footprint. However, this remarkable scientific triumph quickly transformed into agonizing administrative frustration when the meticulously extracted DNA profile was repeatedly run against the National CODIS database and returned absolutely zero matches, leaving dedicated investigators staring at the biological blueprint of a monster with no known name. Years turned into agonizing decades as the original lead detectives retired, passed away, or simply burned out, their long careers entirely defined and ultimately overshadowed by the haunting, mocking specter of the one elusive predator they could never successfully apprehend or identify. The massive cold case files sat dormant in heavily secured evidence lockers, gathering dust while the traumatized survivors were forced to navigate their daily lives with the perpetual, paralyzing fear that the ruthless man who destroyed their sense of fundamental security was still quietly watching them. The sheer volume of agonizing dead ends created a dense atmosphere of profound cynicism within the broader law enforcement community, with many veteran investigators privately resigning themselves to the grim reality that the Golden State Killer would likely die of old age before facing any semblance of earthly justice. Nevertheless, a small, highly dedicated cadre of cold case investigators simply refused to capitulate to time, quietly preserving the delicate biological evidence in the desperate, fading hope that unforeseen future technological advancements might eventually illuminate the darkest corners of this historically impenetrable mystery. The insurmountable, decades-old wall of anonymity finally began to crumble in 2018 when a small, fiercely determined team of modern investigators decided to weaponize the killer's own biology against him by utilizing the entirely unprecedented, highly experimental technique of investigative genetic genealogy. By uploading the preserved, pristine crime scene DNA profile into GEDmatch, a public genealogy database primarily utilized by everyday hobbyists searching for their distant relatives. Investigators successfully generated a sprawling list of third and fourth cousins who shared microscopic fragments of the perpetrator's genetic code. This groundbreaking, extraordinarily tedious strategy required the investigative team to painstakingly construct massive, complex family trees dating all the way back to the early 1800s, meticulously tracing thousands of individual familial branches forward through time in a relentless search for a single, viable male suspect. The exhaustive genealogical mapping eventually directed the intense investigation toward a specific, localized family lineage, allowing detectives to methodically eliminate hundreds of individuals based on their age, gender, and exact geographic location during the precise timeline of the horrific California crime spree. The crosshairs of history finally settled firmly on Joseph James DeAngelo, an unassuming 72-year-old retired truck mechanic living quietly in the suburban neighborhood of Citrus Heights, perfectly situated within the exact geographic epicenter of the original East Area rapist attacks. The shocking revelation that DeAngelo was actually a former police officer who had actively served in neighboring jurisdictions during the absolute height of the terrifying rape series instantly explained his uncanny operational discipline and his profound, devastating ability to completely evade local law enforcement detection, to secure definitive, undeniable proof without prematurely alerting their highly dangerous, heavily armed target. Investigators mounted a covert, multi-day surveillance operation outside DeAngelo's meticulously maintained suburban residence, patiently waiting for an opportunity to secretly collect discarded household items containing his biological material. Indisputable confirmation of his monstrous hidden identity occurred when forensic analysts successfully matched the historical crime scene DNA to fresh genetic samples stealthily obtained from the exterior handle of DeAngelo's car door and a crumpled tissue retrieved from his curbside garbage can. On a quiet, seemingly ordinary spring afternoon, heavily armed tactical units swiftly swarmed the suspect's driveway, completely neutralizing the deeply shocked elderly man before he could retreat into his house or access the numerous firearms he still kept strategically hidden throughout his sprawling property. The dramatic arrest sent massive shockwaves of disbelief across the entire globe, bringing an abrupt, electrifying end to a 40-year reign of terror and violently stripping away the meticulously crafted, completely ordinary facade of a seemingly harmless grandfather who had successfully deceived the world for decades. The dramatic, highly publicized unmasking of Joseph DeAngelo initiated a complex and heavily scrutinized judicial process that aimed to deliver long overdue justice to the victims, while completely avoiding the agonizingly protracted, deeply traumatic spectacle of a traditional, multi-year death penalty trial. Confronted with an absolutely insurmountable mountain of incontrovertible DNA evidence and a meticulous timeline of his whereabouts that perfectly aligned with every single attack, DeAngelo quickly recognized that any attempt to legally deny his involvement would be entirely futile and ultimately self-destructive. In a historic and profoundly emotional courtroom proceeding held in a massive makeshift venue, specifically selected to accommodate the massive crowd, the frail-looking former officer formally pleaded guilty to 13 counts of first-degree murder and publicly admitted to dozens of uncharged rapes in a highly calculated deal specifically brokered to spare his life. For consecutive days, the cavernous courtroom served as a solemn, intensely heavy stage for the surviving victims and the grieving families of the deceased, who finally possessed the incredibly rare opportunity to stand directly in front of their tormentor and loudly articulate the devastating, generational trauma he had ruthlessly inflicted. DeAngelo sat completely motionless and largely expressionless in his wheelchair as he was forced to silently endure the harrowing accounts of shattered marriages, debilitating paranoia, and the profound, enduring grief that had fundamentally defined the tragic existences of those he had so callously victimized during his prime. The presiding judge ultimately sentenced him to multiple consecutive terms of life imprisonment, without the absolute possibility of parole, permanently ensuring that the diabolical architect of California's most terrifying crime spree would draw his final, pathetic breath entirely confined within the bleak walls of a maximum security penitentiary. While the exhaustive legal proceedings provided a definitive, undeniable conclusion to the Golden State Killer saga, the case's remarkable legacy instantly and permanently revolutionized the fundamental methodology of modern homicide investigations across the entire planet. Law enforcement agencies immediately realized that they now possessed a phenomenally powerful, newly forged scientific weapon capable of rapidly unlocking thousands of seemingly impossible, long-forgotten mysteries currently hiding quietly in dusty, entirely ignored evidence room boxes. The unprecedented, spectacular success of genetic genealogy in unmasking such a prolific, highly intelligent phantom conclusively proved that no amount of time, physical distance, or careful criminal planning could permanently shield a perpetrator from the relentless, inevitable march of modern scientific advancement. As D'Angelo was quietly transported to a state prison to permanently vanish into total obscurity, motivated investigators across the country eagerly turned their sharpened attention toward other frozen case files, fully aware that these exact same biological tracking techniques were already closing in on perpetrators who thought they had gotten away, like the brutal killer of a young couple exploring the quiet highways of Washington state. In the late autumn of 1987, 20-year-old Jay Cook and his 18-year-old girlfriend, Tanya Van Cullenborg, embarked on what was supposed to be a routine, overnight errand that simultaneously offered a brief romantic getaway for the young Canadian couple. Both hailing from the peaceful, picturesque city of Victoria, British Columbia, they were deeply grounded individuals who maintained strong familial ties and exhibited a level of maturity and responsibility that far exceeded their relatively young ages. Jay was a kind-hearted, easygoing young man who dutifully worked for his father's heating and ventilation company, always willing to take on extra responsibilities to help support his family's growing local business. Tanya, who was still in the final stages of completing her high school education, was a bright, athletic, and fiercely independent teenager who had recently developed a profound passion for photography and artistic expression. The primary objective of their short trip across the international border was strictly practical, as Jay's father had asked the responsible young man to drive down to Seattle, Washington, to purchase specialized furnace parts that were completely unavailable in their local Canadian markets. On the cold, overcast morning of November 18, the couple eagerly loaded up their vehicle, a highly conspicuous bronze-colored 1977 Ford Club wagon van, completely unaware that their mundane itinerary was about to intersect with a uniquely localized evil. Their families waved goodbye without a single trace of apprehension, fully expecting the dependable pair to return home the very next day with the necessary supplies and a few innocent stories about their brief American excursion. The couple successfully boarded the Coho ferry departing from Victoria, crossing the choppy, gray waters of the Strait of Juan de Fuca before arriving safely in the bustling port town of Port Angeles on the rugged Washington coast. Throughout the afternoon, their journey seemed entirely ordinary and completely uninterrupted, as they were positively identified by multiple witnesses purchasing ferry tickets and picking up minor snacks at a quiet convenience store situated along the scenic Highway 101 in Hoodsport. However, as the dense Pacific Northwest twilight began to aggressively settle over the towering evergreens and winding coastal roads, the young couple unwittingly crossed paths with a predator who viewed their trusting nature and temporary isolation as the perfect opportunity to strike. The deeply ingrained sense of security that Jay and Tanya carried with them from their peaceful Canadian hometown rendered them entirely unprepared for the sudden, calculating brutality of a stranger who was quietly hunting along the desolate rural highways of Washington state. The terrifying realization that something had gone fundamentally wrong began to slowly materialize when the couple failed to return to Victoria on Thursday, November 19, instantly prompting their deeply concerned families to frantically contact local authorities and initiate a missing persons report. A localized sense of dread rapidly escalated into an international crisis when Washington state law enforcement agencies began discovering scattered, horrifying fragments of the couple's journey that definitively painted a picture of absolute, unimaginable violence. Nearly a week after their initial disappearance, a local resident tragically stumbled upon Tanya's partially clothed, frozen body discarded in a remote, heavily wooded ditch in rural Skagit County, located more than 100 miles away from their last confirmed sighting. The forensic examination revealed a scene of profound cruelty and calculating control, as the 18-year-old had been viciously sexually assaulted, securely bound with heavy plastic zip ties, and ultimately executed with a single gunshot wound to the back of the head. The sheer brutality of the crime scene sent massive shockwaves through the typically quiet rural community, fundamentally terrifying local residents who suddenly realized a highly organized, heavily armed predator was actively operating within the dense forests surrounding their peaceful homes. 2 agonizing days later, the nightmare expanded further south when hunters exploring the dense brush beneath a bridge in neighboring Snohomish County discovered the battered, lifeless body of Jay Cook, who had suffered an equally horrific and violent demise. The young man had been brutally beaten with a blunt instrument and mercilessly strangled with a piece of twine and a dog collar, indicating a prolonged, intensely violent struggle against an attacker who possessed overwhelming physical strength and remorseless determination. The geographical logistics of the double homicide immediately presented a massive, bewildering challenge for the investigating detectives, as the victims were discovered brutally murdered in 2 entirely separate counties, while their bronze van was ultimately located abandoned in a 3rd jurisdiction, Bellingham. Inside the recovered vehicle, investigators meticulously gathered a chilling collection of physical evidence, including Tanya's discarded identification, the keys to the van left tauntingly on the floorboard, and a pair of surgical gloves that suggested the killer possessed a terrifying degree of premeditated operational awareness. Most importantly, forensic technicians managed to extract biological evidence from the abandoned vehicle and from Tanya's remains, securing a pristine DNA profile of the unknown male assailant that would become the absolute focal point of an agonizing, multi-decade pursuit. Despite possessing the killer's fundamental genetic blueprint and a wealth of circumstantial clues scattered across 3 distinct counties, the sprawling investigation abruptly slammed into an impenetrable wall as the biological sample failed to match any known offenders in local or national criminal databases. For more than 30 agonizing years, the horrific double murder of Jay Cook and Tanya Van Kallenborg stood as one of the most frustrating, deeply haunting cold cases in the entire history of the Pacific Northwest, relentlessly mocking the dedicated detectives who refused to let the investigation die. The highly unusual geographic dispersion of the crime scenes, spanning Skagit, Snohomish, and Whatcom counties, initially forced the creation of a massive, multi-jurisdictional task force that struggled to seamlessly coordinate their efforts amidst a staggering influx of thousands of completely useless public tips. Investigators meticulously chased down every conceivable lead, conducting hundreds of intense interviews with local transients, known sex offenders, and violent felons currently incarcerated within the Washington state prison system. Yet every single promising suspect was eventually cleared by solid alibis or definitive scientific testing. The sheer randomness of the crime profoundly troubled seasoned law enforcement professionals who could find absolutely no pre-existing connection between the innocent Canadian teenagers and the brutal killer who had so flawlessly intercepted them on a desolate stretch of coastal highway. As the decades slowly passed, the original detectives assigned to the case eventually retired, passing the massive, deeply depressing case files down to a new generation of investigators who inherited the exact same biological evidence, but possessed significantly more advanced forensic tools. The pristine DNA profile extracted from the crime scene was repeatedly entered into the ever-expanding National CODIS database year after year, with detectives holding their collective breath each time, only to be met with the crushing, repetitive disappointment of zero-matching biological results. The agonizing lack of progress exacted an immeasurable psychological toll on the victims' grieving families in British Columbia, who were forced to endure countless anniversaries and empty holidays entirely consumed by the terrifying knowledge that their children's murderer was walking freely among the general public. In a desperate, highly publicized attempt to generate renewed interest in the stagnant investigation, authorities released highly detailed composite sketches generated by early DNA phenotyping technology, hoping that someone might finally recognize the predicted physical traits of the phantom killer. Despite these innovative efforts, and the continuous offering of substantial monetary rewards for actionable information, the perpetrator's true identity remained completely shrouded in darkness, heavily suggesting that he was a remarkably disciplined individual who had managed to entirely avoid subsequent felony arrests. The case appeared permanently frozen in time, a tragic artifact of 1980s violence securely locked away in a police evidence vault, serving as a grim daily reminder of the profound limitations of traditional law enforcement techniques when confronted with a truly random, highly organized predator. The impenetrable fortress of anonymity surrounding the killer finally collapsed in 2018, directly catalyzed by the unprecedented global success of investigative genetic genealogy that had just dramatically unmasked the Golden State Killer in California. Desperate to capitalize on this revolutionary, highly experimental scientific methodology, Snohomish County cold case detectives partnered with Parabon Nanolabs, a specialized forensic facility equipped to translate the 30-year-old crime scene DNA into a complex, highly searchable genetic data file. By uploading this digitized biological blueprint into the public genealogy database GeneMatch, a brilliant genetic genealogist named Cece Moore successfully identified two second cousins of the unknown suspect, providing the very first microscopic crack in the killer's meticulously maintained armor. Over the course of several agonizingly tense days, investigators painstakingly constructed massive, highly complex family trees based on these distant genetic relatives, meticulously tracing the intersecting familial lineages backward through the generations, and then forward again to identify a single, living set of parents. This exhaustive, highly mathematical process of ancestral deduction ultimately isolated a specific family from Washington state, revealing that the couple possessed only one biological son whose age, geographical location, and physical profile perfectly aligned with the parameters of the 1987 double homicide. The crosshairs of the intensive investigation firmly locked onto William Earl Talbot II, a 55-year-old local truck driver who had spent his entire adult life blending seamlessly into the working-class fabric of the Pacific Northwest without ever generating a significant criminal record. Talbot was entirely unaware that he had become the singular focus of a massive, heavily coordinated surveillance operation. As undercover detectives began quietly tailing his commercial delivery truck through the bustling streets of Seattle, patiently waiting for him to discard an item containing his biological signature, the critical, defining moment of the entire decades-long saga occurred when a surveillance team watched Talbot carelessly drop a disposable paper coffee cup from the window of his vehicle, allowing investigators to quickly secure the discarded item before it could be contaminated or lost to the wind. Forensic technicians in the state crime lab worked with breathless urgency to extract a fresh DNA sample from the rim of the cup, directly comparing it against the heavily degraded, 30-year-old biological evidence meticulously preserved from Tanya Van Kallenborg's tragic crime scene. The scientific results confirmed an absolute, mathematically undeniable match, prompting heavily armed police units to swiftly intercept Talbot and place him under arrest, finally bringing an abrupt, shocking end to 3 decades of unpunished freedom for a man who thought he had completely outsmarted the system. The sudden arrest of William Talbot Tello sent massive shockwaves through the global legal community, as this specific prosecution officially marked the very first time in human history that a suspect identified through investigative genetic genealogy would directly face a jury trial. In June 2019, the highly anticipated legal proceedings commenced in Snohomish County, completely stripping away Talbot's carefully constructed, thoroughly ordinary facade, as prosecutors systematically presented the staggering, incontrovertible biological evidence linking him directly to the horrific double homicide. Faced with the absolute certainty of the scientific data, the defense attempted to argue that the DNA merely proved a brief, consensual encounter rather than murder. A highly improbable narrative that completely failed to explain the extreme brutality and complex geographical logistics of the crimes. After deliberately absorbing the harrowing testimonies and meticulously examining the forensic timeline, the jury deliberated for less than 3 days before returning a definitive, unanimous verdict of guilty on 2 counts of aggravated first-degree murder, completely sealing the fate of the aging truck driver. Talbot was subsequently sentenced to 2 consecutive terms of life imprisonment, without the absolute possibility of parole, permanently ensuring that he would be entirely removed from society and forced to spend the remainder of his natural life confined within the bleak walls of a state penitentiary. Although the conviction briefly faced a significant procedural hurdle when a state appellate court temporarily overturned the verdict due to a technical issue regarding juror bias, the Washington State Supreme Court ultimately intervened in 2021, unanimously reinstating the original conviction and permanently closing the legal loophole. The families of Jay Cook and Tanya Van Kylenborg, who had endured more than 30 years of unimaginable, suffocating grief, finally experienced a profound sense of objective closure, officially witnessing the man who violently destroyed their children permanently stripped of his freedom. The historic, completely unprecedented success of the Talbot trial firmly established genetic genealogy not merely as a fascinating investigative tool, but as a robust, legally sound mechanism capable of securing undeniable convictions in a court of law. As Talbot was quietly processed into the maximum security facility to begin his terminal sentence, the profound impact of his historic downfall echoed loudly through the completely silent halls of cold case archives nationwide. The terrifying reality that a remorseless killer could successfully masquerade as a completely ordinary, hardworking citizen for decades without detection was a chilling paradigm that investigators in Iowa were simultaneously confronting as they quietly closed in on a respected businessman who had brutally slaughtered a high school girl in a snowy mall parking lot in 1979. In the freezing, twilight hours of late December 1979, the bustling Midwestern city of Cedar Rapids, Iowa was completely consumed by the festive, innocent energy of the rapidly approaching holiday season, entirely oblivious to the localized tragedy that was about to unfold. The newly constructed Westdale Mall stood as a glowing, architectural epicenter for the community, drawing hundreds of families, teenagers, and holiday shoppers into its brightly lit corridors to escape the biting winter winds that swept across the expansive plains. Among the cheerful crowds navigating the sprawling retail complex was 18-year-old Michelle Martinko, a remarkably bright, highly popular high school senior whose vibrant personality and exceptional musical talents had firmly established her as a beloved figure within her local community. Having just attended a celebratory choir banquet at her high school earlier that evening, Michelle decided to take a brief, solitary detour to the busy shopping center with the mundane intention of purchasing a new winter coat, perfectly illustrating the profound sense of safety that permeated the era. She drove her family's large, distinctively heavy 1972 Bic Electra, maneuvering through the packed parking lot with the casual confidence of a teenager who had absolutely no reason to fear the familiar, snow-dusted streets of her own hometown. The residents of Cedar Rapids lived their daily lives deeply anchored in traditional Midwestern values, characterized by an implicit trust in their neighbors, a collective reliance on local law enforcement, and a widespread belief that horrific, random acts of violence were exclusively confined to the chaotic streets of distant coastal metropolises. Michelle, who eagerly anticipated her upcoming graduation and possessed a promising future filled with collegiate aspirations and artistic pursuits, seamlessly blended into the tapestry of this secure, tightly knit community, utterly unaware that a predator was currently operating within the very same geographical space. Her completely ordinary, utterly routine itinerary on that specific winter night was indicative of an era where young women frequently ran errands alone without constantly monitoring their surroundings or actively anticipating the sudden, brutal intrusion of a completely unprovoked attacker. The fundamental illusion of impenetrable suburban security was entirely dependent on the assumption that public spaces remained inherently safe, a comforting psychological barrier that completely blinded the local populace to the harsh reality of opportunistic predators, quietly blending into large holiday crowds. This deeply ingrained collective innocence was fundamentally incompatible with the terrifying event that was about to violently permanently fracture the community's sense of peace, ensuring that the residents of Cedar Rapids would never again view an empty parking lot without experiencing a lingering, suffocating sense of dread. The irreversible destruction of this Midwestern tranquility occurred in the early, frigid hours of December 20, directly triggered by the agonizing realization of Michelle's parents that their responsible, highly dependable daughter had completely failed to return home from her brief shopping excursion. Panic rapidly escalated as dawn broke, prompting the deeply terrified family to immediately contact local authorities, who swiftly initiated a widespread search of the immediate commercial district, desperately hoping to locate the missing teenager or her highly recognizable vehicle. The chilling climax of this frantic, localized manhunt materialized in the desolate, completely frozen parking lot of the Westdale Mall, where patrolling officers tragically discovered the family's tan-colored Buick Electra sitting silently among the scattered patches of dirty snow. Approaching the completely locked vehicle, investigators peered through the frosted windows and were immediately confronted with a scene of unimaginable, profound brutality that completely defied the previously established boundaries of violence within their quiet jurisdiction. Inside the blood-soaked interior of the car lay the lifeless body of Michelle Martinko, who had been viciously stabbed nearly 30 times in the face, neck, and chest during an incredibly ferocious, desperately fought struggle for her own survival. The highly chaotic nature of the crime scene and the severe defensive wounds extensively covering the young woman's hands definitively indicated that she had fiercely fought her attacker with every ounce of her strength, transforming the enclosed space of the vehicle into a horrifying battleground. The sheer, unrestrained savagery of the murder completely bewildered the seasoned detectives, who struggled to comprehend how such a loud, intensely violent altercation could occur in a public commercial parking lot without a single witness raising an alarm or intervening to save the dying teenager. Law enforcement immediately recognized that this was not a robbery gone wrong or a standard property crime, but rather a deeply personal, highly aggressive assault perpetrated by an individual who possessed a terrifying capacity for extreme, unprovoked physical violence against a completely random target. The horrific discovery plunged the entire city of Cedar Rapids into an immediate state of paralyzing fear, fundamentally altering the daily habits of terrified citizens who suddenly realized that a completely unhinged, heavily armed killer was actively stalking the aisles and parking areas of their most popular commercial hubs. This devastating, precipitating event marked the grim, heartbreaking beginning of an agonizingly slow, 4-decade-long quest for justice. As detectives carefully collected the blood-stained evidence from the shattered interior of the Buick, completely unaware of how long it would take for science to finally catch up to the killer's careless mistakes. In the immediate aftermath of the horrific homicide, a massive, highly coordinated investigative dragnet was cast over the entire region. Yet the relentless efforts of the Cedar Rapids Police Department repeatedly collided with an impenetrable wall of frustrating dead ends and entirely useless, circumstantial tips. Detectives meticulously interviewed hundreds of Michelle's classmates, local mall employees, and known violent offenders residing in the area, aggressively chasing down every conceivable lead in a desperate attempt to identify an individual who possessed the motive and opportunity to commit such a heinous act. A critically important detail quietly emerged from the forensic analysis of the chaotic crime scene, as investigators definitively concluded that the perpetrator had severely lacerated his own hands during the frenzied attack, leaving trace amounts of his own blood, carefully mingled with the victims on the steering wheel, the gear shift, and Michelle's dress. For decades, this microscopic biological signature remained absolutely useless, securely locked away in a climate-controlled evidence vault as the original investigators slowly aged, retired, and carried the heavy, haunting burden of the unsolved Martinko case with them into their twilight years. The advent of sophisticated forensic DNA profiling in the mid-2000s provided a massive resurgence of hope, allowing a completely new generation of detectives to successfully extract a pristine, highly detailed genetic profile of the unknown male killer directly from the heavily stained fabric of Michelle's dress. However, this monumental scientific achievement was immediately followed by crushing, agonizing disappointment, as the meticulously generated profile was repeatedly cross-referenced against the National CODIS database year after year, consistently returning absolutely zero matches and indicating the killer had miraculously completely avoided any subsequent felony convictions. The tragic case remained firmly stalled in a state of indefinite paralysis until 2018, when the increasingly desperate cold case unit decided to weaponize the exact same highly experimental technique of investigative genetic genealogy that had recently dismantled the anonymity of perpetrators on the West Coast. By partnering with the specialized forensic facility Parabon Nanolabs, investigators carefully uploaded the killer's digitized biological blueprint into a public genealogical database, successfully identifying distant genetic cousins and initiating the extraordinarily complex, highly tedious process of backwards familial mapping. Operating with meticulous precision, genetic genealogists spent countless hours constructing massive, highly intricate family trees, relentlessly tracing the intersecting ancestral lines of immigrants who had settled in Iowa during the previous century in order to isolate a single, living set of common descendants. This exhaustive, heavily mathematical process of scientific deduction ultimately funneled the vast investigation down to a specific, localized family, providing detectives with a tightly focused list of 3 brothers who precisely matched the age, gender, and geographical parameters required to execute the brutal 1979 murder. The intensive focus of the relentless police investigation rapidly narrowed onto Jerry Lynn Burns, a completely unremarkable 64-year-old local businessman who had spent his entire adult life successfully masquerading as an ordinary, law-abiding citizen in the quiet neighboring town of Manchester, Iowa. Burns completely embodied the mundane, heavily structured existence of a respected community member, operating a local powder, coating business and regularly interacting with neighbors who had absolutely no conception that they were casually conversing with a remorseless killer who had violently slaughtered a teenage girl 40 years prior. Recognizing the extreme necessity of securing undeniable, incontrovertible biological evidence before executing an arrest, the cold case detectives immediately initiated a highly secretive, multi-day surveillance operation, quietly trailing the unassuming businessman as he went about his completely ordinary daily routines. The specialized undercover team patiently shadowed Burns through the quiet streets of Manchester, meticulously waiting for a single, careless mistake that would legally allow them to covertly harvest his discarded genetic material without triggering his suspicion or prompting him to destroy potential evidence. The decisive, historically monumental moment of the entire 40-year saga materialized inside a local pizza ranch restaurant, where plainclothes investigators intensely watched as Burns casually finished his beverage and carelessly left a crumpled napkin and a plastic drinking straw resting on the table as he exited the establishment. Detectives swiftly swooped in to secure the discarded items, meticulously packaging the plastic straw and rushing it to the state forensic laboratory with absolute breathless urgency, fully aware that the microscopic saliva left on the plastic held the definitive key to resolving the city's most haunting mystery. The highly anticipated scientific results confirmed an absolute, mathematically undeniable match, directly linking the fresh DNA extracted from the drinking straw to the heavily degraded blood stains found on Michelle Martinko's dress, successfully closing a biological loop that had remained open for nearly 4 decades. Armed with this incontrovertible scientific certainty, heavily armed tactical units completely surprised the aging businessman at his quiet workplace, abruptly placing him in handcuffs and violently ripping away the meticulously constructed facade of normalcy he had successfully maintained since the Carter administration. The dramatic apprehension occurred on December 19, 2018, exactly 39 years to the very day that Michelle Martinko was viciously murdered, injecting a profound, almost poetic sense of definitive justice into the conclusion of a case that had completely traumatized the entire state of Iowa. The stunning arrest of Jerry Lynn Burns initiated a highly publicized, deeply emotional legal reckoning, forcibly dragging the horrific events of 1979 into a modern courtroom and permanently obliterating the quiet, respectable life the defendant had fraudulently enjoyed for decades. During the heavily scrutinized trial in early 2020, state prosecutors systematically dismantled any potential defense by heavily relying on the absolute, indisputable certainty of the genetic genealogy, logically proving to the jury that the blood found on the victim's dress could not possibly belong to anyone other than the defendant. Burns sat completely motionless and entirely expressionless as the prosecution meticulously reconstructed the brutal ferocity of the attack, forcing him to publicly confront the horrific reality of the violence he had unleashed upon a completely innocent teenager who was merely trying to purchase a winter coat. The defense is desperate. Highly improbable attempts to suggest that the DNA might have been transferred accidentally or contaminated over the decades completely failed to resonate with a jury that was explicitly confronted with the staggering statistical probability of the exact biological match. Following a remarkably brief period of intense deliberation, the jury returned a definitive, unanimous verdict of guilty on the charge of first-degree murder, completely sealing the fate of the aging businessman and permanently ensuring his complete removal from civilized society. The presiding judge subsequently sentenced Burns to a mandatory term of life imprisonment without the absolute possibility of parole, officially guaranteeing that the man who had stolen Michelle Martinko's future would draw his final breath entirely confined within the bleak, unforgiving walls of a maximum security state penitentiary. For the surviving members of Michelle's family and the older generation of Cedar Rapids residents who had lived in perpetual fear since that freezing December night, the definitive conviction provided a profound, deeply emotional sense of objective closure that many had previously assumed was permanently unattainable. The devastating reality that a brutal, remorseless murderer could successfully seamlessly integrate himself into a quiet community, raise a family, and run a business without ever arousing a single suspicion served as a chilling, unforgettable testament to the terrifying duality of human nature. This deeply unsettling phenomenon of monsters hiding in plain sight was not an isolated incident confined to the snowy parking lots of the Midwest, as another highly organized predator was actively utilizing an equally mundane existence to mask a horrific, 15-year campaign of calculated sexual violence, terrorizing the residents of Northern California while quietly working at a prestigious university. Throughout the early 1990s, the sprawling, picturesque landscape of Northern California was defined by its vibrant university towns and quietly affluent suburban enclaves, offering a seemingly impenetrable haven for young professionals and ambitious students. Communities such as Davis Chico and Rohnert Park prided themselves on their exceptionally low violent crime rates, fostering an environment where residents routinely jogged alone at dusk and frequently left their apartment windows unlocked to catch the cool evening breeze. This pervasive atmosphere of localized trust and profound communal security was deeply embedded in the cultural fabric of the region, blinding the unsuspecting populace to the very real vulnerabilities intentionally designed into their relaxed residential architecture. Young women living independently in these quiet neighborhoods went about their daily academic and professional routines, entirely unaware that they were being meticulously observed by a highly intelligent, intensely disciplined predator who seamlessly blended into their surroundings. The chilling reality was that the very quietness of these idyllic streets provided the perfect acoustic cover for an intruder who spent countless hours silently mapping out escape routes, identifying target vulnerabilities, and learning the precise schedules of his entirely innocent victims. To the outside world, this hidden observer appeared to be an entirely ordinary, completely respectable professional, utilizing a mundane existence as a meticulously crafted shield to mask a profoundly dark, obsessive compulsion for absolute domination. His day job as an environmental health and safety specialist at a prestigious university ironically granted him an intimate, authoritative understanding of security protocols, risk management, and the fundamental psychological blind spots of the general public. Operating completely beneath the radar of local law enforcement, he weaponized his professional knowledge of residential layouts and community habits, transforming peaceful apartment complexes into personal hunting grounds with terrifying efficiency. The young women who retreated to the supposed sanctuary of their bedrooms each night possessed absolutely no reason to suspect that a phantom had already marked their doors, patiently waiting for the precise moment when the entire neighborhood descended into deep, uninterrupted slumber. This fragile illusion of absolute safety, built upon decades of suburban tranquility, was precariously balancing on the edge of a catastrophic precipice, about to be violently shattered by a 15-year campaign of calculated terror that would permanently alter the psychological landscape of Northern California. The terrifying collapse of this regional peace officially commenced in 1991 in the quiet city of Rohnert Park, when a young woman was violently jolted from her sleep by a masked intruder who had effortlessly bypassed her residential security measures. Armed with a handgun and operating with a chilling, heavily practiced calmness, the assailant swiftly bound his deeply terrified victim, initiating a horrific, agonizingly prolonged assault that completely defied the parameters of a typical home invasion. When a strikingly similar, highly organized attack occurred a few weeks later in a completely different municipality, seasoned investigators were forced to confront the horrifying realization that a serial offender was actively utilizing the sprawling highway system to connect disparate hunting grounds. The perpetrator's methodology was incredibly distinct and profoundly terrifying, specifically characterized by his deliberate practice of taking absolute psychological and physical control of his victims for hours at a time, repeatedly assaulting them while simultaneously ransacking their homes for specific, seemingly insignificant trophies. In a bizarre, highly audacious escalation of violence, the attacker frequently forced his captive, severely traumatized victims to dress and accompany him to local ATMs under the explicit threat of death, demanding they withdraw cash, while he carefully concealed his identity from the surveillance cameras. The chilling moniker of the NorCal rapist was quickly adopted by terrified regional media outlets as the horrific attacks rapidly multiplied across 6 different Northern California counties, establishing a massive geographic footprint that severely complicated coordinated police efforts. The sheer brazenness of his methods, constantly crossing jurisdictional lines and striking completely distinct demographic profiles, indicated a predator who possessed immense geographical mobility and an absolute, deeply ingrained confidence in his ability to permanently evade law enforcement apprehension. A suffocating wave of paranoia swept across the sprawling region as specialized task forces realized the attacker was intentionally utilizing the fragmented nature of local police departments to his tactical advantage, striking unpredictably and then vanishing completely without leaving a single actionable investigative trail. Local hardware stores were entirely depleted of deadbolts, motion sensor lights, and window alarms as deeply terrified residents desperately attempted to fortify their apartments against an invisible entity who seemed capable of bypassing any standard commercial security measure. This relentless, terrifying expansion of his localized hunting grounds officially established the absolute point of no return for the community, marking the definitive beginning of a deeply frustrating, agonizingly protracted cat and mouse game between a highly organized phantom and a completely overwhelmed regional law enforcement apparatus. As the devastating attacks continued sporadically until his final known assault in 2006, the sprawling multi-jurisdictional investigation morphed into a massively complex, utterly frustrating endeavor that consistently yielded absolutely no definitive suspects. Detectives across 6 entirely separate counties meticulously collected a massive repository of circumstantial evidence and harrowing victim testimonies, desperately attempting to construct a viable psychological and physical profile of the phantom, who was relentlessly tormenting their communities. The perpetrator consistently demonstrated a terrifying degree of forensic awareness, meticulously wearing gloves, carefully utilizing specialized masks to conceal his features, and deliberately avoiding the creation of any obvious physical evidence that could readily identify him through traditional police databases. Despite his highly disciplined operational security, dedicated crime scene technicians successfully managed to extract pristine biological DNA samples from several of the chaotic attack scenes, providing investigators with a fundamental genetic blueprint of the region's most prolific active predator. For more than 2 agonizing decades, this scientifically flawless DNA profile was repeatedly uploaded into the National CODIS database, consistently returning 0 biological matches and completely verifying that the attacker had miraculously managed to avoid any subsequent felony arrests or incarcerations. The sheer volume of agonizing dead ends and completely exhausted leads generated a dense atmosphere of profound professional frustration among the dedicated detectives, many of whom were forced into retirement while heavily burdened by the haunting memories of the traumatized survivors they could not protect. The victims themselves were forced to navigate the incredibly difficult, lifelong process of psychological recovery, while perpetually carrying the terrifying, suffocating knowledge that the remorseless man, who had fundamentally destroyed their sense of safety, was still walking freely among the general public. Countless investigative task forces were aggressively formed and subsequently disbanded, as the localized trails repeatedly grew cold, transforming the active pursuit into a massive, heavily archived cold case that occupied thousands of pages of dusty files within heavily secured police evidence vaults. Despite the seemingly insurmountable passage of time and the complete lack of traditional investigative momentum, a small, fiercely dedicated cadre of forensic analysts stubbornly refused to capitulate, meticulously preserving the original biological evidence in the desperate hope that future scientific advancements would eventually illuminate the darkness. This agonizing period of investigative paralysis ultimately represented the darkest era of the decades-long manhunt, serving as a grim testament to the profound limitations of conventional policing when actively confronted by an intelligent, highly adaptable predator who seamlessly integrates himself back into the very community he is systematically destroying. The impenetrable, decades-old wall of complete anonymity finally began to violently crumble in the late summer of 2018, directly catalyzed by the unprecedented, heavily publicized success of investigative genetic genealogy that had recently revolutionized cold case methodologies nationwide. Desperate to weaponize this highly experimental, revolutionary scientific technique, Sacramento authorities formally partnered with specialized genealogists who meticulously uploaded the preserved, 30-year-old crime scene DNA into public open-source ancestry databases. Operating with absolute highly focused precision, the team successfully identified distant genetic relatives of the unknown suspect, initiating the extraordinarily complex, deeply mathematical process of constructing massive familial trees spanning multiple generations of California residents. This exhaustive process of microscopic ancestral deduction relentlessly eliminated hundreds of potential suspects before ultimately directing the intensive investigation firmly toward Roy Charles Waller, a completely unassuming 58-year-old safety specialist who had been quietly employed at the University of California, Berkeley, for decades. The absolute shock of discovering that the highly organized, deeply sadistic predator was actually a well-respected, highly educated professional who regularly managed safety protocols on a major college campus completely fundamentally redefined the parameters of the entire investigation. Recognizing the absolute, critical necessity of legally acquiring incontrovertible biological proof before prematurely alerting their highly dangerous target, detectives immediately initiated a heavily coordinated, highly secretive surveillance operation centered entirely on Waller's daily, completely mundane routines. Undercover tactical units patiently shadowed the aging university employee for several agonizingly tense days, meticulously waiting for a single, careless mistake that would legally allow them to covertly harvest his discarded genetic material without triggering his well-documented evasive instincts. The definitive, historically monumental breakthrough occurred when a highly trained surveillance officer, successfully recovered a discarded drinking straw from a public trash receptacle that Waller had casually utilized during a completely ordinary lunch break. Forensic technicians functioning inside the state crime laboratory worked with breathless, unparalleled urgency to extract a fresh DNA sample from the recovered item, confirming an absolute, mathematically undeniable match with the heavily degraded biological evidence collected during the horrific 1991 home invasions. Armed with this incontrovertible scientific certainty, heavily armed law enforcement units swiftly surrounded Waller on the bustling university campus, abruptly snapping handcuffs onto the wrists of the stunned safety specialist and violently destroying the carefully constructed, decades-long facade of the region's most feared phantom. The stunning, highly publicized arrest of Roy Charles Waller immediately initiated a massive, deeply emotional legal reckoning, permanently forcing the horrific, heavily suppressed events of the 1990s into the glaringly bright, heavily scrutinized environment of a modern courtroom. During the remarkably intense trial that finally commenced in late 2020, state prosecutors systematically dismantled the defendant's completely fabricated persona of innocence by heavily relying on the absolute, mathematically indisputable certainty of the advanced genetic genealogy and biological profiling. Waller sat completely motionless, heavily guarded, and entirely devoid of any visible emotion, as the prosecution meticulously reconstructed the brutal ferocity of his 15-year campaign, forcing him to publicly confront the undeniable reality of the immense suffering he had intentionally inflicted upon his innocent victims. Dozens of highly traumatized survivors bravely took the witness stand, powerfully reclaiming their stolen agency by directly confronting the pathetic, aging man who had previously terrorized them behind a carefully utilized mask in the absolute darkness of their own bedrooms. The defense's desperately formulated attempts to systematically undermine the fundamental integrity of the DNA collection process completely collapsed under the overwhelming, undeniable weight of the forensic evidence directly linking Waller to 9 entirely separate, horrific crime scenes. Following a brief period of intense deliberation, the jury returned a definitive, completely unanimous verdict of guilty on all 46 felony counts, comprehensively ensuring the absolute destruction of his previously unblemished public reputation. The presiding superior court judge explicitly recognized the unimaginable severity of the defendant's completely remorseless actions, aggressively sentencing Waller to a staggering 97 years to life in a maximum security state penitentiary, officially guaranteeing he would never again experience a single moment of freedom. For the completely shattered victims and the dedicated, exhausted investigators who had relentlessly pursued the phantom for nearly 3 decades, the monumental conviction provided a profound, deeply emotional sense of objective closure that firmly validated their enduring perseverance. The terrifying revelation that a deeply methodical, highly organized predator could successfully maintain a mundane professional career while orchestrating a localized reign of terror stood as a profoundly chilling testament to the completely deceptive nature of human sociopathy. This profoundly disturbing phenomenon of a brutal monster, completely masking his violent urges behind a carefully constructed, seemingly ordinary exterior, was a dark reality uniquely shared by another elusive predator operating further north, who successfully hid behind a remarkably quiet life for decades after violently snatching a 12-year-old girl named Michelle Welch from a sunny public park. In the early spring of 1986, the city of Tacoma, Washington embodied the quintessential, rugged charm of the Pacific Northwest, providing a seemingly safe, heavily forested environment where working-class families raised their children with a profound sense of localized trust. The sprawling, densely wooded expanse of Puget Park served as a massive communal backyard for the surrounding residential neighborhoods, offering a labyrinth of dirt trails, deep ravines, and towering evergreen canopies that continually invited innocent exploration. During this era, entirely preceding the advent of constant digital surveillance and cellular communication, it was considered completely normal and inherently safe for young children to spend their entire daylight hours roaming these public spaces without immediate adult supervision. 12-year old Michelle Welch was a remarkably responsible, deeply caring older sibling who perfectly represented the trusting, independent spirit of her local community, frequently taking charge of her two younger sisters to afford their hardworking mother a brief respite. Known among her peers and teachers as a bright, highly dependable girl with a vibrant smile, Michelle seamlessly navigated her local neighborhood with the casual, completely unburdened confidence of a child who had absolutely no reason to fear the familiar shadows of her own hometown. The dense foliage and uneven terrain of the beloved local park provided a picturesque, seemingly impenetrable sanctuary for the neighborhood youth, completely blinding the local populace to the harsh, terrifying reality that such isolated environments could easily conceal a highly motivated predator. This deeply ingrained, collective assumption of public safety rested upon a fragile psychological foundation that entirely ignored the inherent vulnerabilities intentionally woven into the geography of a city bordering vast, unmanaged wilderness. Parents went to work each morning completely unaware that the very landscapes they encouraged their children to explore could effortlessly facilitate an ambush, allowing a violent individual to operate entirely undetected just yards away from bustling residential streets. The children who eagerly retreated to the shaded trails of the park possessed absolutely no mechanism to recognize the quiet, stalking presence of an opportunistic killer who viewed their innocent games as a perfectly constructed hunting scenario. This profound, localized illusion of an idyllic childhood sanctuary was precariously balancing on the edge of an unfathomable tragedy, entirely unprepared for a sudden explosion of extreme violence that would permanently shatter the innocence of Tacoma and transform a beloved community park into a monument of enduring horror. The fundamental trust that bound the community together was about to be violently eradicated by a single, remorseless act of brutality that would force every parent in the region to permanently reevaluate the boundaries of safety. The tragic events that were destined to unfold beneath the towering pines would leave an indelible, suffocating scar on the psychological landscape of the city, irrevocably altering the way generations of local residents interacted with the natural world around them. The irreversible destruction of this quiet coastal tranquility occurred on the unusually warm morning of March 26, when Michelle dutifully assumed responsibility for her younger sisters during their spring break, taking them to play in the familiar, winding trails of Puget Park around mid-morning. The highly responsible 12-year-old decided to briefly leave her siblings in the designated play area while she rode her bicycle back to their nearby home to prepare a simple lunch of peanut butter sandwiches for the trio. This completely mundane, entirely routine errand perfectly encapsulated her reliable nature, yet it tragically created a brief, fatal window of isolation that a completely unknown, heavily opportunistic predator immediately recognized as the perfect moment to execute a horrific assault. When Michelle eventually returned to the park, carrying the brown paper bags containing their lunch, she discovered that her sisters had wandered away to search for her, leaving her standing alone in a secluded section of the sprawling recreational area. The terrifying realization that something had gone fundamentally wrong began to slowly materialize when the younger girls returned to the designated meeting spot, only to find Michelle's bicycle abandoned on the grass alongside the untouched brown paper bags. Panic rapidly escalated as the hours ticked by without any sign of the responsible older sister, prompting the deeply terrified family to immediately contact local law enforcement, who swiftly initiated a massive, localized search of the dense, highly irregular terrain. The chilling climax of this frantic, desperate manhunt materialized late that evening when a search dog led heavily armed officers into a deep, heavily overgrown ravine completely obscured from the main walking paths. Hidden within a makeshift fire pit area, investigators tragically discovered the lifeless, heavily battered body of the young girl, completely verifying the community's absolute worst fears and plunging the entire city into an immediate, paralyzing state of profound terror. The forensic examination of the horrific crime scene revealed a level of unrestrained savagery that completely bewildered seasoned detectives, as the completely innocent child had been mercilessly sexually assaulted, severely beaten with blunt force, and ultimately executed with a fatal laceration to her throat. The highly chaotic nature of the brutal attack definitively indicated that the perpetrator possessed a terrifying capacity for extreme, completely unprovoked physical violence against an incredibly vulnerable target in broad daylight. This devastating, precipitating event marked the grim, agonizing beginning of a multi-decade quest for justice, securely locking the traumatized residents of Tacoma into a perpetual state of fear as they slowly realized a monstrous killer was actively walking freely among them. The horrific discovery permanently transformed the previously beloved park into an active, heavily restricted crime scene, ensuring that the local children would never again view the towering trees without feeling a lingering, suffocating presence of unseen danger. In the immediate aftermath of the brutal homicide, the Tacoma Police Department cast a massive, highly coordinated investigative dragnet over the entire region, aggressively chasing down thousands of completely useless public tips that ultimately led to frustrating dead ends. The localized sense of panic was exponentially magnified just a few months later when another young girl was tragically murdered in the exact same park, leading terrified residents and overwhelmed investigators to incorrectly assume that a highly organized serial killer was actively hunting their children. Detectives meticulously interviewed hundreds of local transients, known sex offenders, and residents of the surrounding neighborhoods, desperately attempting to construct a viable psychological profile of an individual who possessed the absolute depravity required to slaughter a child in a public space. A critically important biological detail quietly emerged from the rigorous forensic analysis of the chaotic crime scene, as highly dedicated technicians successfully collected trace amounts of the perpetrator's DNA, meticulously left behind during the frenzied, deeply violent assault. For several decades, this microscopic genetic signature remained absolutely useless, securely locked away in a climate-controlled evidence vault while the original investigators slowly retired, carrying the heavy, deeply haunting burden of the unsolved Welch case into their twilight years. The advent of highly sophisticated forensic DNA profiling in the early 2000s provided a massive resurgence of hope, definitively proving that the two highly publicized park murders were actually committed by completely different individuals, thereby splitting the massive investigation into two entirely separate, agonizingly difficult cold cases. The pristine genetic profile extracted from Michela's crime scene was repeatedly cross-referenced against the ever-expanding National CODIS database year after year, consistently returning absolutely zero matches and heavily indicating that the brutal killer had miraculously avoided any subsequent felony incarcerations. The massive cold case files sat completely dormant, gathering dust while the deeply traumatized Welch family was forced to navigate their daily existence with the perpetual, paralyzing fear that the remorseless man who destroyed their lives was still quietly observing them. Countless investigative task forces were aggressively formed and subsequently disbanded as the localized trails repeatedly grew cold, transforming the active, highly publicized pursuit into a massive historical artifact that occupied hundreds of pages of dusty police reports. Despite the seemingly insurmountable passage of time and the complete evaporation of traditional investigative momentum, a small, fiercely dedicated cadre of cold case detectives stubbornly refused to capitulate, meticulously preserving the original biological evidence in the desperate hope of a future scientific miracle. The sheer volume of agonizing dead ends created a dense atmosphere of profound professional cynicism, with many veteran investigators privately resigning themselves to the grim reality that the phantom killer would likely die of natural causes long before facing earthly justice. However, this deeply entrenched investigative paralysis was quietly preparing to be entirely shattered by the sudden emergence of a revolutionary technological methodology that would soon weaponize the killer's own biology against him. The impenetrable, decades-old fortress of complete anonymity finally began to violently crumble in 2018, directly catalyzed by the unprecedented, heavily publicized success of investigative genetic genealogy that was actively revolutionizing cold case resolutions across the entire country. Desperate to capitalize on this highly experimental, groundbreaking scientific technique, Tacoma authorities formally partnered with specialized genetic genealogists who meticulously uploaded the preserved, 30-year-old crime scene DNA into public open-source ancestry databases, operating with absolute, highly focused precision. The investigative team successfully identified multiple distant genetic relatives of the unknown suspect, initiating the extraordinarily complex, deeply mathematical process of constructing massive familial trees spanning several generations of Washington residents. This exhaustive process of microscopic ancestral deduction relentlessly eliminated hundreds of potential suspects based on age and geographic parameters, before ultimately directing the intensive investigation firmly toward Gary Hartman, a completely unassuming 66-year-old community nurse specialist. The absolute shock of discovering that the highly organized, deeply sadistic predator was actually a well-respected healthcare professional who had spent decades explicitly tasked with caring for the vulnerable completely fundamentally redefined the terrifying parameters of the entire investigation. Recognizing the absolute, critical necessity of legally acquiring incontrovertible biological proof before prematurely executing an arrest, detectives immediately initiated a heavily coordinated, highly secretive surveillance operation centered entirely on Hartman's daily, completely mundane routines. Undercover tactical units patiently shadowed the aging nurse through the busy streets of Tacoma, meticulously waiting for a single, careless mistake that would legally allow them to covertly harvest his discarded genetic material without triggering his well-documented evasive instincts. The definitive, historically monumental breakthrough occurred when a highly trained surveillance team successfully followed Hartman into a local restaurant, quietly observing him as he ate his meal and subsequently wiped his mouth with a brown paper napkin. As the unsuspecting suspect casually crumpled the completely mundane item and abandoned it on the table, plainclothes detectives swiftly swooped in to secure the discarded napkin. Rushing the heavily protected biological sample to the state forensic laboratory with absolute breathless urgency, the highly anticipated scientific results confirmed an absolute, mathematically undeniable match, directly linking the fresh DNA extracted from the restaurant napkin to the heavily degraded genetic evidence meticulously collected from Michelle Welch's tragic crime scene over 3 decades prior. Armed with this incontrovertible scientific certainty, heavily armed law enforcement units swiftly intercepted Hartman during his completely ordinary morning commute, abruptly placing him in handcuffs and violently destroying the carefully constructed, completely fraudulent facade of normalcy he had maintained for 32 years. The dramatic, highly publicized apprehension instantly sent massive shockwaves of disbelief through the medical community and the general public, officially ending one of the most agonizing, intensely frustrating manhunts in the history of the Pacific Northwest. The stunning, completely unexpected arrest of Gary Hartman immediately initiated a massive, deeply emotional legal reckoning, permanently forcing the horrific, heavily suppressed events of 1986 into the glaringly bright, heavily scrutinized environment of a modern, heavily guarded courtroom. During the remarkably intense trial that officially commenced in early 2022, state prosecutors systematically dismantled the defendant's entirely fabricated persona of an innocent healthcare worker by heavily relying on the absolute, mathematically indisputable certainty of the advanced genetic profiling. Hartman sat completely motionless and entirely devoid of any visible remorse, as the prosecution meticulously reconstructed the brutal ferocity of his unprovoked attack, forcing him to publicly confront the undeniable reality of the immense suffering he had intentionally inflicted upon a completely innocent child. The defense's desperately formulated, highly improbable attempts to systematically undermine the fundamental integrity of the DNA collection process completely collapsed under the overwhelming, undeniable weight of the pristine forensic evidence directly linking him to the horrific scene in Puget Park. Following a brief period of intense deliberation, the presiding judge explicitly recognized the unimaginable severity of the defendant's completely merciless actions, decisively convicting Hartman of first-degree murder and comprehensively ensuring the absolute destruction of his previously unblemished public reputation. The court subsequently sentenced the aging predator to more than 26 years in a maximum, Security State Penitentiary, officially guaranteeing that the man who violently stole Michela's future would draw his final, pathetic breath entirely confined within a bleak concrete cell. For the completely shattered Welch family and the dedicated, exhausted investigators who had relentlessly carried the heavy burden of the unsolved case for more than 3 decades, the monumental conviction provided a profound, deeply emotional sense of objective closure. The devastating reality that a brutal, deeply remorseless murderer could successfully seamlessly integrate himself into a noble profession like nursing without ever arousing a single suspicion served as a profoundly chilling testament to the completely deceptive nature of human sociopathy. This deeply unsettling phenomenon of a monstrous killer, entirely masking his violent history behind the completely mundane routines of daily life, proved that the most dangerous predators do not lurk strictly in shadows, but frequently hide entirely in plain sight. As Hartman was quietly permanently removed from civilized society, the phenomenal, legally undeniable power of genetic genealogy continued to aggressively illuminate the darkest, most stagnant corners of police archives across the state. This exact same relentless, highly advanced scientific methodology was already quietly zeroing in on another elusive, deeply hidden Washington state killer, slowly unmasking a completely unremarkable delivery driver who had brutally abducted and murdered a vibrant young woman named Mandy Stavik on a quiet rural road. The undeniable triumph of justice in Tacoma resonated powerfully among cold case detectives nationwide, fueling a renewed, entirely unyielding determination to completely eradicate the anonymity of offenders who believed time was their absolute protector. The era of the untouchable phantom had officially ended, giving rise to an entirely new age of relentless scientific accountability that would permanently alter the fate of those who thought they had completely gotten away. In the late autumn of 1989, the rural, tightly knit community of Clipper in Whatcom County, Washington, represented a deeply idyllic, isolated sanctuary completely defined by its sprawling farmlands, dense evergreen forests, and the profoundly trusting nature of its local residents. During the highly anticipated Thanksgiving holiday, the quiet, picturesque valley welcomed back 18-year-old Mandy Stavik, a remarkably vibrant, deeply beloved college student who had recently returned home from Central Washington University to celebrate the festive season with her closely bonded family. Mandy perfectly embodied the absolute brightest aspirations of the rural community, recognized by everyone as an exceptionally athletic, fiercely independent, and profoundly kind-hearted young woman who maintained a deep, abiding connection to the rugged natural landscape of the Pacific Northwest. On the crisp, heavily overcast afternoon of November 24, the highly energetic teenager decided to embark on a completely routine cardiovascular workout, taking her family's devoted German Shepherd, Kira, for a long jog along the familiar, winding dirt path known locally as Strand Road. This specific rural corridor was incredibly secluded and entirely familiar to the young woman, completely devoid of heavy traffic and typically populated only by the friendly, recognizable faces of longtime neighbors who frequently waved to her as she rapidly passed their sprawling properties. The fundamental concept of stranger danger was entirely foreign to the residents of this peaceful agricultural valley, who routinely left their front doors entirely unlocked and fundamentally believed that the geographic isolation of their community provided an absolute, impenetrable shield against the chaotic violence of the outside world. Mandy's completely carefree, entirely mundane athletic routine on that specific Friday afternoon perfectly encapsulated the deeply ingrained, completely unquestioned assumption of safety that heavily characterized the region, blinding the unsuspecting populace to the terrifying reality that a predator was actively sharing their secluded environment. The young college student jogged confidently past the quiet farmhouses and dense tree lines, utterly unaware that her athletic endurance and familiar route were secretly being observed by a highly opportunistic, profoundly depraved individual who viewed her temporary vulnerability as an absolute invitation for extreme violence. This beautiful, entirely peaceful afternoon in the remote Washington Valley was precariously hovering on the absolute brink of an unimaginable nightmare that would permanently eradicate the innocence of the entire county. The residents of this agricultural haven were entirely unprepared for the sudden, brutal intrusion of a completely unprovoked attacker who would forcefully introduce a suffocating era of enduring paranoia, fundamentally altering the psychological foundation of the community for generations to come. The devastating collapse of this profound rural tranquility officially commenced mere hours later, entirely triggered by the agonizing, deeply terrifying realization of Mandy's mother that the family's loyal German shepherd had returned to their farmhouse completely alone, bearing completely dry fur despite the immediate proximity to the nearby river. Panic rapidly escalated within the tightly knit household as the late afternoon shadows aggressively lengthened, prompting the deeply terrified family to frantically contact local authorities and initiate a massive, highly coordinated search of the dense, highly irregular terrain surrounding the familiar jogging road. The entire community rapidly mobilized with absolute, breathless urgency, deploying hundreds of dedicated civilian volunteers, heavily trained tracking dogs, and specialized search and rescue teams to meticulously comb through the sprawling agricultural fields, deep ravines, and the freezing, fast-flowing waters of the nearby Nooksack River. The agonizing, localized sense of dread was completely validated 3 days later, culminating in a horrific, completely soul-crushing discovery when a volunteer firefighter tragically located Mandy's lifeless body submerged in the shallow, freezing waters of the turbulent river, located several miles away from her original jogging path. The rigorous forensic examination of the chaotic, heavily compromised crime scene definitively revealed a scene of absolute, unrestrained savagery, proving that the vibrant young college student had been viciously abducted, mercilessly sexually assaulted, and deliberately drowned in a terrifyingly intimate, intensely violent encounter. The sheer, unprovoked brutality of the murder completely bewildered seasoned law enforcement professionals, who heavily struggled to comprehend how a highly athletic, incredibly strong young woman could be so quickly overpowered and entirely removed from a public roadway without a single witness raising a localized alarm. Law enforcement immediately recognized that this was not a tragic accident or a spontaneous property crime, but rather a deeply personal, highly aggressive assault perpetrated by an individual who possessed intimate, comprehensive knowledge of the local geography and completely understood the isolated nature of the rural valley. The horrific, completely devastating discovery plunged the entire county into an immediate, deeply paralyzing state of profound terror, fundamentally altering the daily habits of terrified residents who suddenly realized a highly organized, remorseless killer was actively operating within the dark fringes of their beloved community. This devastating, heavily traumatic, precipitating event marked the grim, completely heartbreaking beginning of a massive, heavily complicated 30-year quest for definitive justice, as dedicated detectives carefully collected microscopic biological evidence from the freezing river, completely unaware of the agonizingly protracted investigative stalemate that eagerly awaited them. The shocking murder permanently transformed the previously beloved rural jogging routes into heavily feared, deeply avoided zones, firmly ensuring that the local residents would never again allow their children to wander the dense forests without experiencing a lingering, intensely suffocating presence of unseen localized danger. In the immediate, highly chaotic aftermath of the brutal homicide, the Whatcom County Sheriff's Office rapidly cast a massive, heavily coordinated investigative dragnet over the entire region, aggressively chasing down thousands of completely useless public tips and exhaustively interviewing every single male resident residing within a 5-mile radius of the crime scene. Detectives meticulously collected a massive repository of circumstantial evidence, heavily relying on the absolute, critical biological breakthrough achieved when forensic technicians successfully extracted a pristine, highly detailed DNA profile of the unknown male killer, meticulously preserved from the victim's heavily traumatized body. Possessing this flawless genetic blueprint, frustrated investigators initiated a completely unprecedented, highly ambitious voluntary DNA sweep of the local community, eventually requesting and successfully collecting saliva samples from hundreds of cooperative deeply concerned men in a desperate attempt to rapidly identify the hidden predator. However, this monumental, highly exhaustive scientific endeavor was completely met with crushing, entirely agonizing disappointment, as the meticulously generated crime scene profile consistently failed to match any of the localized samples and returned absolutely zero results when repeatedly cross-referenced against the ever-expanding National CODIS database. The massive, deeply depressing cold case files sat completely dormant for nearly 3 decades, gathering heavy dust while the deeply traumatized Stavik family was cruelly forced to navigate their daily existence with the perpetual, heavily paralyzing fear that the remorseless man who violently destroyed their lives was actively escaping earthly justice. Despite the seemingly insurmountable passage of time and the complete evaporation of traditional investigative momentum, a highly dedicated, fiercely stubborn cold case detective named Kevin Boway completely refused to capitulate, meticulously reviewing the dusty, 30-year-old suspect list to identify any individual who had successfully managed to evade the original voluntary biological dragnet. The intense focus of this completely reinvigorated investigation eventually narrowed onto a localized man named Timothy Bass, a completely unassuming delivery truck driver who had lived merely 1.5 miles down the exact same rural road as the Stavik family during the absolute height of the 1989 investigation. Bass had quietly, entirely successfully refused to provide a voluntary DNA sample during the original neighborhood sweeps, heavily citing completely fabricated privacy concerns while continuing to maintain a completely mundane, entirely ordinary professional life that successfully masked his deeply violent, heavily suppressed sociopathic tendencies. Recognizing the absolute, highly critical necessity of legally acquiring incontrovertible biological proof before prematurely executing a localized arrest, desperate detectives immediately initiated a highly secretive, heavily coordinated surveillance operation centered entirely on the delivery driver's completely ordinary daily workplace routines. Undercover tactical units patiently shadowed the aging suspect for several agonizingly tense weeks, meticulously waiting for a single, careless mistake that would legally allow them to covertly harvest his discarded genetic material without triggering his well-documented, highly evasive instincts or completely compromising the entire 30-year investigation. The definitive, historically monumental breakthrough of the entire decades-long saga did not ultimately originate from an advanced forensic laboratory or a highly tactical police operation, but rather from the extraordinary, deeply courageous actions of an entirely ordinary civilian who profoundly recognized the immense gravity of the situation. Frustrated by Bass's incredibly disciplined operational security and his consistent failure to casually discard any viable biological material in a public setting, the desperate lead detective decided to covertly approach the management at Fran's Bakery, the commercial facility where the suspect had been continuously employed for several decades. While the corporate entity firmly declined to formally assist the police investigation without a strictly mandated judicial warrant, a fiercely determined female coworker named Kim Wagner quietly observed the highly unusual law enforcement presence and aggressively took it upon herself to uncover the true nature of the secretive inquiry. Upon independently discovering that her unassuming, seemingly completely ordinary colleague was actually the primary suspect in the most notorious, heavily publicized unsolved murder in the history of Whatcom County, Wagner decisively formulated a highly dangerous, covert plan to secure the elusive biological evidence herself. Operating with absolute, deeply focused precision and unmatched bravery, Wagner patiently monitored Bass during their mundane daily shifts, meticulously waiting for a brief, unguarded moment when the highly cautious man would carelessly abandon an item saturated with his unique genetic signature. The absolutely critical, defining moment of the entire exhausting manhunt successfully materialized during a quiet afternoon shift in 2017. When Wagner intently watched Bass finish a beverage and carelessly toss a plastic cup alongside an empty water bottle directly into a company trash receptacle before immediately exiting the break room, she swiftly swooped in to secure the discarded items, meticulously packaging the handled plastic containers and actively rushing them directly to the deeply grateful, astonished cold case detectives with absolute, breathless urgency. Forensic technicians functioning inside the state crime laboratory eagerly worked around the clock to successfully extract a fresh DNA sample from the recovered items, officially confirming an absolute, mathematically undeniable match with the heavily degraded genetic evidence meticulously collected from Mandy Stavic's tragically violated body. Armed with this incontrovertible, completely flawless scientific certainty, heavily armed law enforcement units swiftly intercepted Timothy Bass during his entirely ordinary morning routine, abruptly snapping heavy handcuffs onto the wrists of the profoundly stunned delivery driver. This deeply dramatic, highly publicized apprehension instantly destroyed the carefully constructed, decades-long facade of normalcy he had successfully maintained, sending massive, unprecedented shockwaves of profound disbelief through the entire rural community and his entirely oblivious workplace. The stunning, entirely unexpected arrest of Timothy Bass instantly initiated a massive, deeply emotional legal reckoning, permanently forcing the horrific, heavily suppressed events of 1989 directly into the glaringly bright, heavily scrutinized environment of a modern Washington courtroom. During the remarkably intense, emotionally charged trial that officially commenced in the late spring of 2019, state prosecutors systematically dismantled the defendant's fabricated persona of an innocent, hardworking family man by heavily relying on the absolute, mathematically indisputable certainty of the advanced biological profiling. Bass sat absolutely motionless and entirely devoid of any visible remorse, as the highly methodical prosecution reconstructed the brutal ferocity of his unprovoked attack, permanently forcing him to publicly confront the undeniable reality of the immense suffering he had intentionally inflicted upon an innocent teenager. The incredibly desperate, highly improbable defense attempts to systematically undermine the fundamental integrity of the flawless DNA collection process utterly collapsed under the overwhelming, undeniable weight of the pristine forensic evidence directly linking him to the horrific crime scene. Following a profoundly brief period of intense, highly focused jury deliberation, the completely unanimous verdict of guilty on the charge of first-degree murder comprehensively ensured the absolute destruction of his previously unblemished public reputation. The presiding judge explicitly recognized the unimaginable severity of the defendant's merciless actions, decisively sentencing Bass to nearly 27 years in a maximum security state penitentiary, officially guaranteeing that the brutal man would spend the absolute remainder of his natural life confined within a bleak concrete cell. For the profoundly shattered Stavic family and the dedicated, exhausted investigators who had relentlessly carried the heavily haunting burden of the unsolved case for nearly 3 decades, the monumental conviction provided a deeply emotional sense of absolute objective closure. The utterly devastating reality that a deeply remorseless murderer could successfully integrate himself into a mundane delivery route without ever arousing a single suspicion served as a profoundly chilling testament to the completely deceptive nature of fundamental human sociopathy. The incredible, highly courageous actions of a single civilian coworker ultimately definitively proved that the absolute relentless, deeply unyielding pursuit of justice can successfully overpower even the most meticulously crafted, decades-long fraudulent concealment. This deeply unsettling phenomenon of a hidden monster successfully living directly under the very noses of completely oblivious neighbors directly mirrors another horrifying decades-old mystery, where an innocent man wrongfully languished in prison for 20 years while the true, completely remorseless killer of Angie Dodge quietly lived just across the exact same residential street. In the early summer of 1996, the quiet, fundamentally conservative community of Idaho Falls, Idaho, represented a deeply insulated, heavily protected environment where the sprawling agricultural landscapes seamlessly merged with quiet, densely populated residential neighborhoods. 18-year-old Angie Dodge perfectly embodied the vibrant, highly energetic spirit of a young woman, eagerly stepping into the boundless possibilities of early adulthood, having just recently achieved the monumental milestone of moving into her very first independent apartment. She was universally recognized by her peers and family as a remarkably sweet, fiercely independent, and profoundly responsible teenager who had recently graduated from high school and secured a stable job at a local beauty supply store to financially support her newfound autonomy. Her modest, ground-floor apartment situated on a completely unremarkable residential street was meant to serve as a private sanctuary, a physical manifestation of her hard-earned independence, where she could safely transition from the sheltered innocence of childhood into the responsibilities of the adult world. The deeply ingrained, collective assumption of absolute safety within this tightly knit community completely blinded the local populace to the inherent vulnerabilities intentionally woven into the fabric of solitary living. Particularly for a young woman residing completely alone for the very first time in her life. Angie dutifully locked her doors each night, implicitly trusting the fundamental, unwritten social contract that her quiet neighborhood provided an impenetrable, completely reliable barrier against the horrific, random acts of violence that plagued larger, far more chaotic metropolitan areas. However, this profound, localized illusion of suburban tranquility was precariously balancing on the absolute edge of an unfathomable, deeply terrifying nightmare, as the young teenager was entirely unaware that a highly dangerous, fundamentally depraved individual was actively residing within her immediate geographic sphere. The terrifying reality that would soon completely devastate the community was that the most profound threats do not always originate from distant, unknown shadows, but frequently hide entirely in plain sight, casually observing their victims from the deceptive comfort of neighboring properties. The peaceful, heavily familiar street that Angie proudly called her new home was secretly functioning as a meticulously monitored hunting ground, where an opportunistic predator patiently waited for the absolute perfect moment to violently intrude upon her carefully constructed sanctuary. This beautiful, entirely peaceful chapter of her young life was about to be abruptly, permanently eradicated by a single, unprovoked act of extreme brutality that would forcefully introduce a suffocating era of enduring paranoia to the entire city of Idaho Falls. The irreversible, completely devastating destruction of this quiet Midwestern tranquility officially commenced on the unusually warm morning of June 13, entirely triggered by the agonizing, deeply terrifying realization of Angie's coworkers that the highly dependable teenager had completely failed to arrive for her scheduled morning shift. Panic rapidly escalated as the hours ticked by without any communication, prompting her deeply concerned colleagues to proactively travel to her apartment complex, desperately hoping to find her merely oversleeping or experiencing a minor, easily resolvable vehicle malfunction. Upon arriving at her quiet residence, the co-workers discovered the front door entirely unlocked, an incredibly highly unusual circumstance that instantly filled them with a localized sense of profound, suffocating dread as they cautiously stepped into the dimly lit, completely silent apartment. The chilling, entirely heartbreaking climax of this frantic welfare check materialized in the bedroom, where they tragically discovered Angie's lifeless, heavily battered body resting on the floor, completely verifying their absolute worst fears and plunging the entire city into an immediate, paralyzing state of profound terror. The rigorous forensic examination of the chaotic, heavily compromised crime scene definitively revealed a level of unrestrained savagery that completely bewildered seasoned law enforcement professionals, proving that the vibrant young woman had been viciously raped and brutally murdered, nearly decapitated by a severe laceration to her throat. The sheer, completely unprovoked brutality of the murder heavily indicated that the perpetrator possessed a terrifying capacity for extreme, highly aggressive physical violence, transforming the teenager's supposed sanctuary into a horrifying, deeply traumatic battleground where she had desperately fought for her life. Law enforcement immediately recognized that this was an intensely personal, highly violent assault, meticulously collecting a pristine, biologically flawless DNA sample of the unknown male killer, specifically extracted from semen left directly at the horrific crime scene. The horrific, completely devastating discovery instantly shattered the fundamental illusion of safety that had previously defined Idaho Falls, fundamentally altering the daily habits of terrified residents who suddenly realized a highly unhinged, heavily armed killer was actively operating within the dark fringes of their beloved community. This devastating, heavily traumatic precipitating event marked the grim, completely heartbreaking beginning of a massive, incredibly complicated two-decade quest for definitive justice, setting the stage for one of the most agonizing, profoundly unjust investigative failures in the entire history of the American judicial system. In the immediate, highly chaotic aftermath of the brutal homicide, the deeply overwhelmed Idaho Falls Police Department cast a massive, heavily coordinated investigative dragnet over the entire region, aggressively, desperately attempting to pacify a deeply terrified public demanding immediate, decisive law enforcement action. Tragically, this immense, highly localized pressure to quickly resolve the horrific case led investigators down a profoundly dark, deeply flawed path, ultimately entirely focusing their intense scrutiny on a vulnerable, easily manipulated 20-year-old local man named Christopher Tapp. Despite the absolute, mathematically indisputable scientific fact that Tapp's biological DNA profile completely failed to match the pristine genetic evidence meticulously recovered from the victim's body, aggressive detectives subjected the young man to countless hours of intense, heavily coercive psychological interrogation tactics. Over the course of several highly agonizing weeks, investigators repeatedly fed Tapp heavily classified details of the crime scene, utilizing deceptive polygraph examinations and completely fabricated threats of the death penalty to slowly break down his mental defenses and force a highly contradictory, entirely false confession. This deeply horrifying miscarriage of justice culminated in Tapp's absolute wrongful conviction in 1998, resulting in a devastating sentence of life imprisonment that completely destroyed his youth, while the true, deeply remorseless killer continued to walk freely among the unsuspecting public. However, Angie's fiercely dedicated, profoundly courageous mother, Carol Dodge, eventually began to closely review the heavily documented interrogation tapes, rapidly realizing with absolute, horrifying clarity that the frightened young man on the screen had been forcefully coerced and that her daughter's true murderer was still entirely at large. Carol single-handedly transformed herself into an unstoppable, entirely relentless investigative force, publicly challenging the heavily entrenched police narrative, aggressively advocating for Tapp's exoneration, and relentlessly pushing the fundamentally stubborn department to utilize advanced forensic technologies to re-examine the preserved biological evidence. For nearly 2 decades, she endured agonizing, completely suffocating bureaucratic resistance, dedicating her entire existence to tracking down the elusive phantom, whose genetic signature remained securely locked in the evidence vault, consistently returning absolutely zero matches in the National CODIS database. Her monumental, highly exhausted crusade finally began to gain unprecedented momentum in the late 2010s, when she successfully convinced a completely new generation of detectives to weaponize the exact same highly experimental technique of investigative genetic genealogy that was successfully dismantling cold cases nationwide. This agonizing period of deep investigative paralysis and profound judicial failure ultimately represented the absolute darkest era of the entire tragedy, serving as a grim testament to the terrifying consequences of confirmation bias when actively confronted by a completely stagnant, highly publicized murder investigation. The impenetrable, heavily guarded fortress of the killer's complete anonymity finally began to violently crumble in 2019, directly catalyzed by the unprecedented, heavily publicized deployment of advanced genetic genealogy heavily championed by Carol Dodge and dedicated forensic experts. Operating with absolute, highly focused precision, specialized genealogists meticulously uploaded the preserved, 23-year-old crime scene DNA into public open-source ancestry databases, successfully identifying multiple distant genetic relatives and initiating the extraordinarily complex, deeply mathematical process of backwards familial mapping. This exhaustive process of microscopic ancestral deduction relentlessly eliminated hundreds of potential suspects, before ultimately directing the intensive investigation firmly toward Brian Dripps, a completely unremarkable, heavily aging man who was currently living quietly in Caldwell, Idaho. The absolute, completely mind-bending shock of the entire genealogical discovery was rapidly compounded by a chilling, deeply horrifying realization regarding the historical geography of the case in 1996, Brian Dripps had lived entirely directly across the exact same residential street from Angie Dodge's apartment. Recognizing the absolute, highly critical necessity of legally acquiring incontrovertible biological proof before prematurely executing a localized arrest, desperate detectives immediately initiated a highly secretive, heavily coordinated surveillance operation centered entirely on the unassuming suspect's completely mundane daily routines. Undercover tactical units patiently shadowed Dripps through the busy streets of Caldwell, meticulously waiting for a single, careless mistake that would legally allow them to covertly harvest his discarded genetic material, without triggering his heavily suppressed evasive instincts. The definitive, historically monumental breakthrough occurred when a highly trained surveillance team successfully observed the aging man carelessly toss a completely mundane, heavily used cigarette butt out the window of his vehicle, allowing investigators to immediately secure the heavily discarded item from the pavement. Forensic technicians functioning inside the state crime laboratory eagerly worked with absolute, breathless urgency to successfully extract a fresh DNA sample from the recovered item, officially confirming an absolute, mathematically undeniable match with the heavily degraded genetic evidence meticulously collected from the 1996 crime scene. Armed with this incontrovertible, completely flawless scientific certainty, heavily armed law enforcement units swiftly intercepted Brian Dripps, abruptly placing him in handcuffs and violently tearing down the carefully constructed, decades-long facade of normalcy he had successfully maintained while an entirely innocent man languished in a prison cell for his horrific crime. The stunning, entirely unexpected arrest of Brian Dripps instantly initiated a massive, deeply emotional legal reckoning, permanently forcing the horrific, heavily suppressed events of 1996 directly into the glaringly bright, heavily scrutinized environment of a modern, heavily guarded courtroom. Confronted with the absolute, mathematically indisputable certainty of the advanced biological profiling, Dripps completely folded during his initial police interrogation. Formally confessing that he had heavily consumed alcohol and cocaine, before simply walking across the street with a knife, originally intending only to commit a sexual assault before the situation violently escalated into absolute murder. During the remarkably intense legal proceedings that subsequently followed, Dripps formally pleaded guilty to first-degree murder and rape, definitively sparing the deeply traumatized Dodge family the agonizing, heavily protracted spectacle of a traditional, highly publicized criminal trial. The presiding judge explicitly recognized the unimaginable severity of the defendant's completely merciless actions, decisively sentencing the remorseless predator to 20 years to life in a maximum security state penitentiary, officially guaranteeing he would spend his final, pathetic years entirely confined behind heavily fortified concrete walls. This monumental, highly delayed conviction simultaneously secured the absolute, complete exoneration of Christopher Tapp, who was officially legally cleared of all charges after enduring 20 horrific years of completely unjust incarceration. Though his completely stolen youth could never be mathematically calculated or returned. For the profoundly shattered Dodge family and the incredibly brave mother who had relentlessly carried the heavy burden of the truth for more than 2 decades, the monumental conviction provided a deeply emotional sense of absolute objective closure that firmly validated her enduring, entirely unyielding perseverance. The completely devastating reality that a brutal, deeply remorseless murderer could successfully seamlessly blend into the exact same neighborhood, casually watching the horrific aftermath of his own crime from his front window, served as a profoundly chilling testament to the incredibly deceptive nature of human sociopathy. This deeply unsettling phenomenon of a hidden monster successfully terrorizing a local community, while actively mocking the completely overwhelmed law enforcement apparatus, directly mirrors another horrifying decades-old mystery that completely traumatized a quiet city in Indiana. The exact same relentless, highly advanced scientific methodology was absolutely crucial in finally unmasking a deeply sadistic predator who spent decades leaving terrifying, completely handwritten notes for police after brutally murdering a completely innocent 8-year-old girl named April Tinsley. In the spring of 1988, the industrious working-class city of Fort Wayne, Indiana, represented a quintessentially stable Midwestern community deeply rooted in traditional family values, heavy manufacturing, and an unwavering localized trust that tightly bound neighbors together. The sprawling residential neighborhoods were characterized by modest, tightly packed houses with unfenced yards, creating a sprawling communal playground where local children routinely roamed freely from dawn until dusk without ever triggering a single moment of parental anxiety. 8-year-old April Tinsley was a remarkably vibrant, deeply trusting and endlessly curious first grader who perfectly embodied the innocent, completely carefree spirit of a community that fundamentally believed its children were inherently safe within the familiar city limits. She possessed an infectious smile and a highly recognizable, brightly colored winter jacket, making her a familiar, beloved presence as she skipped along the cracked concrete sidewalks of her quiet, seemingly impenetrable neighborhood. During this era, entirely preceding the advent of constant digital surveillance and cellular communication, it was considered entirely normal for young children to navigate their local streets independently, relying heavily on the collective watchful eyes of long-time residents to maintain an invisible, impenetrable shield of absolute security. The adults of Fort Wayne lived their daily lives deeply anchored in the comforting psychological illusion that horrific, random acts of predatory violence were exclusively confined to the chaotic, heavily populated streets of distant coastal metropolises, completely ignoring the potential for a monster to lurk in their own backyards. April's completely ordinary, entirely routine afternoon of playing with her neighborhood friends on that specific April day perfectly encapsulated this deeply ingrained, completely unquestioned assumption of localized safety that heavily characterized the region. The community was utterly unaware that their peaceful, blue-collar haven was secretly being aggressively monitored by a highly opportunistic, profoundly depraved individual who viewed their trusting nature and temporary vulnerabilities as an absolute invitation for unimaginable violence. This beautiful, entirely peaceful era of Midwestern innocence was precariously hovering on the absolute brink of an unfathomable nightmare that would permanently eradicate the foundational security of the entire city. The residents of Fort Wayne were entirely unprepared for the sudden, brutal intrusion of a completely unprovoked attacker who would forcefully introduce a suffocating, multi-generational era of enduring paranoia, fundamentally altering the psychological landscape of the region for decades. The devastating, irreversible collapse of this profound Midwestern tranquility officially commenced on the heavily overcast, bitterly cold afternoon of Good Friday, April 1, 1988, entirely triggered by the agonizing realization that young April had completely vanished while walking a mere 2 blocks to retrieve an umbrella from a friend's house. Panic rapidly escalated within the tightly knit household as the freezing evening shadows aggressively lengthened, prompting her deeply terrified family to frantically contact local authorities and rapidly initiate a massive, highly coordinated search of the dense, highly irregular urban terrain. The entire community rapidly mobilized with absolute, breathless urgency, deploying hundreds of dedicated civilian volunteers, heavily trained tracking dogs, and specialized search and rescue teams to meticulously comb through the sprawling residential streets, abandoned industrial buildings, and deep wooded ravines bordering the city limits. The agonizing, localized sense of dread was completely validated 3 incredibly tense days later, culminating in a horrific, completely soul-crushing discovery when a civilian jogger tragically located the young girl's lifeless body discarded in a water-filled drainage ditch situated roughly 20 miles away in neighboring DeKalb County. The rigorous forensic examination of the chaotic, heavily compromised crime scene definitively revealed a scene of absolute, unrestrained savagery, proving that the vibrant 8-year-old had been viciously abducted, mercilessly sexually assaulted, and deliberately suffocated in a terrifyingly intimate, intensely violent encounter. The sheer, completely unprovoked brutality of the murder completely bewildered seasoned law enforcement professionals, who heavily struggled to comprehend how an innocent child could be so quickly overpowered and entirely removed from a public sidewalk in broad daylight without a single witness raising a localized alarm. Law enforcement immediately recognized that this was not a tragic accident or a spontaneous vehicular incident, but rather a deeply personal, highly aggressive assault perpetrated by an exceptionally dangerous individual who possessed intimate, comprehensive knowledge of the local geography. The horrific, completely devastating discovery plunged the entire city of Fort Wayne into an immediate, deeply paralyzing state of profound terror, fundamentally altering the daily habits of terrified parents who suddenly realized a highly organized, remorseless killer was actively operating within the dark fringes of their beloved community. This devastating, heavily traumatic precipitating event marked the grim, completely heartbreaking beginning of a massive, heavily complicated 30-year quest for definitive justice, forcing the traumatized residents to permanently lock their doors and aggressively monitor their children's every single movement. The shocking murder permanently transformed the previously beloved neighborhood's sidewalks into heavily feared, deeply avoided zones, firmly ensuring that the local residents would never again allow their children to walk alone without experiencing a lingering, intensely suffocating presence of unseen, localized danger. In the immediate, highly chaotic aftermath of the brutal homicide, the deeply overwhelmed Fort Wayne Police Department cast a massive, heavily coordinated investigative dragnet over the entire region, completely failing to identify a viable suspect despite aggressively chasing down thousands of completely useless public tips and exhaustively interviewing known local offenders. The massive, deeply depressing investigation eventually stalled completely, transforming into a chilling cold case until exactly 2 years later, when the deeply arrogant, entirely remorseless killer deliberately shattered the silence by writing a horrific, completely handwritten confession on a local barn door, explicitly taunting authorities by stating he killed 8-year-old April and promising to strike again. This profoundly terrifying psychological warfare aggressively escalated over the subsequent decades, reaching a terrifying zenith in 2004 when the highly sadistic predator intentionally left a series of deeply disturbing notes alongside heavily used condoms, securely taped to the bicycles of young girls in various Fort Wayne neighborhoods. These deeply grotesque, heavily threatening messages explicitly mocked the completely paralyzed law enforcement apparatus, heavily boasting about the 1988 murder, while overtly threatening the new, entirely innocent recipients with the exact same horrific fate, instantly reigniting a localized wave of absolute paralyzing panic across the entire city. However, the killer's intense, completely arrogant desire to actively terrorize the local community ultimately provided investigators with their absolute most critical forensic breakthrough, as specialized crime scene technicians successfully extracted a pristine, highly detailed DNA profile of the unknown male killer, meticulously preserved from the bodily fluids left on the discarded items. Possessing this flawless genetic blueprint, intensely frustrated investigators initiated a completely unprecedented, highly ambitious biological dragnet, continuously uploading the profile into the National CODIS database year after year, yet consistently experiencing crushing, entirely agonizing disappointment as the system returned absolutely zero matches. The agonizing lack of progress exacted an immeasurable psychological toll on the victim's deeply grieving family, who were brutally forced to endure countless anniversaries and empty holidays entirely consumed by the terrifying, heavily taunting knowledge that their child's murderer was not only free, but actively stalking new victims. Detectives meticulously utilized advanced DNA phenotyping in a desperate, highly publicized attempt to generate a predictive visual profile of the aging killer, distributing composite sketches that ultimately failed to generate any actionable, definitive leads from the deeply terrified public. The incredibly massive cold case files sat completely unresolved for nearly 3 decades, deeply haunting the dedicated investigators, who stubbornly refused to capitulate. Meticulously preserving the highly controversial biological evidence in the desperate, fading hope that unforeseen future technological advancements might eventually illuminate the darkness. This agonizing period of deep investigative paralysis and profound psychological torture completely represented the absolute darkest era of the entire tragedy, heavily proving that the killer thrived on a deeply sickening sense of omnipotence while actively hiding directly within the traumatized community. The impenetrable, decades-old fortress of the sadistic killer's complete anonymity finally began to violently crumble in the spring of 2018, directly catalyzed by the unprecedented, heavily publicized success of investigative genetic genealogy that was simultaneously revolutionizing cold case resolutions across the entire country. Desperate to permanently eradicate this localized terror, Fort Wayne authorities formally partnered with the specialized forensic genealogists at Parabon Nanolabs, meticulously uploading the preserved, 14-year-old DNA extracted from the Taunting bicycle notes into completely public open-source ancestry databases. Operating with absolute, highly focused precision, the incredibly brilliant investigative team successfully identified multiple distant genetic relatives of the unknown suspect, rapidly initiating the extraordinarily complex, deeply mathematical process of constructing massive familial trees spanning several generations of Indiana residents. This exhaustive process of microscopic ancestral deduction relentlessly eliminated hundreds of potential suspects based on age and geographic parameters, ultimately directly funneling the intensive investigation firmly toward two local brothers, eventually zeroing in on John D. Miller, a completely unremarkable, heavily reclusive 59-year-old man living in a dilapidated trailer park in Graybill, Indiana. The absolute shock of discovering that the highly organized, deeply sadistic predator who had mercilessly taunted the police for 30 years was actually a completely unassuming, socially isolated local resident completely fundamentally redefined the terrifying parameters of the entire historical investigation. Recognizing the absolute, highly critical necessity of legally acquiring incontrovertible biological proof before prematurely executing a localized arrest, desperate detectives immediately initiated a highly secretive, heavily coordinated surveillance operation centered entirely on the reclusive suspect's completely mundane daily routines. Undercover tactical units patiently shadowed Miller around his rural trailer park, meticulously waiting for a single, careless mistake that would legally allow them to covertly harvest his discarded genetic material, without triggering his heavily documented, deeply arrogant, evasive instincts. The definitive, historically monumental breakthrough occurred when detectives successfully recovered completely mundane trash bags discarded outside Miller's trailer, explicitly locating heavily used condoms within the garbage that allowed the state forensic laboratory to successfully extract a fresh, completely pristine DNA sample. The highly anticipated scientific results confirmed an absolute, mathematically undeniable match, directly linking the fresh DNA to the heavily degraded genetic evidence meticulously collected from the 2004 bicycle notes and the original 1988 crime scene, providing incontrovertible scientific certainty of his absolute guilt. Heavily armed law enforcement units swiftly descended upon the quiet trailer park, abruptly placing the aging man in handcuffs, completely shocking the suspect who immediately, entirely calmly confessed to the brutal crime the moment detectives explicitly asked him if he knew why they were there, softly muttering April Tinsley's name. The stunning, entirely unexpected arrest of John Miller instantly initiated a massive, deeply emotional legal reckoning, permanently forcing the horrific, heavily suppressed events of 1988 directly into the glaringly bright, heavily scrutinized environment of a modern, heavily guarded Indiana courtroom. Confronted with the absolute, mathematically indisputable certainty of the advanced biological profiling and his own recorded confessions, Miller completely recognized that any highly protracted legal defense would be entirely futile, rapidly deciding to formally plead guilty to the charges of first-degree murder and child molestation in December 2018, during the remarkably intense, deeply somber sentencing hearing. The completely remorseless predator sat absolutely motionless and entirely devoid of any visible empathy as the victim's deeply shattered mother delivered a powerful, completely heartbreaking impact statement, heavily demanding that the monster who destroyed her family permanently rot in a concrete cell. The presiding judge explicitly recognized the unimaginable severity of the defendant's completely merciless actions and his decades of deliberate psychological torture, decisively sentencing Miller to 80 years in a maximum security state penitentiary, officially guaranteeing he would never again experience a single moment of freedom. This monumental, Highly delayed conviction permanently secured absolute, objective justice for a completely innocent 8-year-old girl, firmly closing one of the most notoriously terrifying, deeply frustrating cold cases in the entire history of the American Midwest. For the profoundly shattered Tinsley family and the dedicated, exhausted investigators who had relentlessly carried the heavily haunting burden of the unsolved case for exactly 30 years, the definitive incarceration provided a deeply emotional sense of absolute closure that firmly validated their enduring perseverance. The completely devastating reality that a brutal, deeply remorseless murderer could successfully seamlessly blend into the exact same localized region, hiding quietly in a rural trailer while aggressively taunting authorities, served as a profoundly chilling testament to the completely deceptive nature of fundamental human sociopathy. The incredibly unyielding pursuit of justice definitively proved that absolutely no amount of arrogant boasting or highly disciplined operational security can permanently shield a predator from the relentless, mathematically precise march of modern scientific advancement, as Miller was quietly permanently transported to his final, deeply isolated prison cell. His complete downfall echoed loudly through the completely silent halls of cold case archives nationwide, severely warning other hidden killers that their remaining time was rapidly evaporating. This deeply unsettling phenomenon of an incredibly arrogant killer who actively craved localized attention directly mirrors another terrifyingly prolific predator who spent decades playing highly twisted, completely manipulative games with law enforcement, ultimately leading a remarkably ordinary, heavily publicized double life until his own deeply horrified daughter finally connected the horrific dots. In the mid to late 20th century, the American landscape was dotted with close, knit communities where a reformed man could supposedly leave his troubled past behind and seamlessly integrate into the wholesome fabric of suburban family life. Edward Wayne Edwards perfectly exploited this deeply ingrained cultural forgiveness, actively presenting himself to the world as a completely reformed former criminal who had successfully traded a life of minor delinquency for the noble responsibilities of a dedicated husband and loving father. Throughout the 1970s and 1980s, he continuously relocated his growing family across various states, utilizing his charismatic, aggressively friendly personality to secure odd jobs as a handyman, a park groundskeeper, and even a published author who penned a memoir heavily detailing his supposed rehabilitation. He brazenly appeared on national television programs, confidently looking directly into the camera to sell his entirely fabricated narrative of redemption, implicitly demanding the public's absolute trust and admiration for his dramatic personal turnaround. His children were raised in a strict, seemingly traditional household, completely unaware that their father's rigid rules and sudden, midnight decisions to uproot the family were not the quirks of a hardworking provider, but the highly calculated evasive maneuvers of a prolific predator. To his unsuspecting neighbors and the local congregations he frequently joined, Edwards appeared to be the absolute embodiment of the American dream realized through hard work and faith, heavily masking a profoundly dark, completely remorseless sociopathy that fundamentally governed his every action. This elaborate, deeply theatrical facade of normalcy was intricately designed to function as an impenetrable shield, allowing him to operate in plain sight while he meticulously scouted vulnerable targets across multiple jurisdictions without ever drawing a single glance of suspicion from local law enforcement. The communities that welcomed him with open arms inherently believed his charming anecdotes and reformed persona, entirely blind to the terrifying reality that they were actively harboring a heavily practiced, highly opportunistic serial killer who viewed their trusting nature as a weakness to be exploited. This completely deceptive, highly manipulative existence successfully allowed Edwards to maintain an illusion of absolute respectability, ensuring that his horrific, deeply violent impulses remained completely obscured beneath a thick veneer of mundane domesticity. And was deeply unsettling contrast between the loving father he pretended to be and the absolute monster he truly was would eventually become the foundational horror of a multi-decade deception that ultimately shattered his own family. The irreversible destruction of this carefully cultivated illusion officially commenced with a horrific series of double homicides that would eventually become known by terrified communities as the infamous Sweetheart Murders, specifically highlighting the devastating 1980 tragedy in Jefferson County, Wisconsin. On a remarkably warm August night, 19-year-old Timothy Hack and his 18-year-old girlfriend, Kelly Drew, attended a joyous local wedding reception at a popular banquet hall, perfectly encapsulating the completely innocent, heavily trusting spirit of the rural Midwestern community. When the deeply devoted young couple completely failed to return to their respective homes the following morning, a localized sense of absolute, suffocating dread rapidly engulfed the tightly knit town, prompting deeply terrified families and overwhelmed local authorities to rapidly initiate a massive, highly coordinated search of the surrounding agricultural landscape. The agonizing, completely heartbreaking climax of this frantic, localized manhunt materialized several weeks later, when a local farmer tragically discovered the heavily decomposed bodies of the young lovers, discarded deep within a heavily wooded area miles away from the banquet venue. The rigorous forensic examination of the chaotic, heavily compromised crime scene definitively revealed a level of unrestrained savagery that completely bewildered seasoned law enforcement professionals, proving that the teenagers had been viciously abducted, and while Kelly was mercilessly sexually assaulted and strangled, Timothy was brutally stabbed to death during a desperate fight for survival. The sheer, completely unprovoked brutality of the double murder heavily indicated that the perpetrator possessed a terrifying capacity for extreme, highly aggressive physical violence, completely shattering the fundamental illusion of safety that had previously defined the quiet Wisconsin county. Law enforcement immediately recognized that this was an intensely personal, highly organized assault perpetrated by a heavily experienced predator who deliberately targeted completely innocent couples, enjoying their youth in seemingly safe, highly populated communal environments. This devastating, heavily traumatic precipitating event marked the grim, completely heartbreaking beginning of a massive, incredibly complicated cold case, plunging the entire region into an immediate, deeply paralyzing state of profound terror as residents suddenly realized a highly unhinged, heavily armed killer was actively operating within their beloved community. As detectives carefully collected microscopic biological evidence from the tragic scene, they were completely unaware that the architect of this absolute atrocity was already heavily integrating himself into a new town, entirely protected by his meticulously crafted, highly deceptive identity as a reformed family man. The horrific, completely unprovoked slaughter of the young sweethearts firmly ensured that local parents would never again view a peaceful summer night without experiencing a lingering, intensely suffocating presence of unseen, localized danger. In the immediate, highly chaotic aftermath of the brutal Wisconsin homicides, the deeply overwhelmed local police departments cast a massive, heavily coordinated investigative dragnet over the entire region, aggressively chasing down thousands of completely useless public tips that ultimately led to deeply frustrating, entirely stagnant dead ends. This exact same terrifying, completely unsolved pattern mirrored another horrific double murder that had occurred 3 years prior in 1977, when another young couple, Billy Lavaco and Judy Straub, were viciously gunned down in a quiet park in Norton, Ohio, leaving heavily baffled detectives staring at a complete absence of actionable evidence. For several decades, these utterly devastating cold cases sat completely dormant in deeply secured evidence vaults across different states, gathering heavy dust, while the deeply traumatized families were cruelly forced to navigate their daily existence with the perpetual, heavily paralyzing fear that the remorseless man who violently destroyed their lives was actively escaping earthly justice. Meanwhile, Edwards continued to live his completely fabricated, highly chaotic life, frequently uprooting his profoundly confused wife and children in the dead of night to rapidly flee across state lines whenever his deeply paranoid instincts falsely suggested that local law enforcement might be quietly closing in on his hidden atrocities. The killer possessed an incredibly arrogant, deeply sadistic compulsion to actively monitor the ongoing police investigations, frequently inserting himself directly into the localized narratives by completely inappropriately offering his unsolicited assistance to overwhelmed detectives or aggressively writing public letters to local newspapers under the completely fraudulent guise of a concerned, highly observant citizen. This profoundly terrifying psychological warfare actively thrived on a deeply sickening sense of absolute omnipotence. As Edwards heavily relied on his heavily publicized, completely fabricated reputation as a rehabilitated author to successfully deflect any microscopic moments of suspicion that occasionally arose during routine police canvassing. Despite the seemingly insurmountable passage of time and the complete evaporation of traditional investigative momentum, highly dedicated forensic technicians in Wisconsin stubbornly refused to capitulate, meticulously preserving the highly degraded biological semen sample successfully recovered from Kelly Drew's clothing in the desperate, fading hope of a future scientific miracle. The incredibly massive cold case files remained completely unresolved for nearly 30 years, heavily haunting the original investigators who slowly retired while carrying the heavy, deeply depressing burden of the unsolved Sweetheart murders directly into their twilight years. This agonizing period of deep investigative paralysis completely represented the absolute darkest era of the entire tragedy, heavily proving that the killer's meticulous operational security and highly transient lifestyle had successfully created an impenetrable fortress of absolute anonymity. The completely devastated communities heavily resigned themselves to the grim reality that the phantom predator would likely die of natural causes, long before facing any semblance of formal judicial accountability. The impenetrable, heavily guarded fortress of the killer's complete anonymity finally began to violently crumble in 2009, directly catalyzed not by a highly sophisticated law enforcement operation, but by the unprecedented, incredibly courageous actions of the killer's own deeply traumatized daughter, April Balacio. Having heavily endured a highly chaotic, profoundly abusive childhood completely defined by her father's aggressive outbursts and extremely suspicious midnight relocations, April had spent her adult life deeply haunted by a lingering, entirely suffocating intuition that her seemingly reformed father was secretly hiding a highly terrifying, incredibly violent past. While casually researching her heavily fragmented childhood on the internet, she stumbled upon highly detailed true crime articles discussing the unsolved 1980 Sweetheart murders in Wisconsin, rapidly realizing with absolute, horrifying clarity that her father had worked as a handyman at the exact same venue where the young couple had completely vanished. As she meticulously referenced the precise dates and localized geographies of other notoriously unsolved double homicides across the Midwest, the deeply horrifying dots aggressively connected, definitively proving that her father's frantic, unexplained cross-country flights directly coincided with the exact timelines of the horrific, heavily publicized slaughters. Operating with absolute, highly focused precision and completely unmatched bravery, April decisively formulated a highly dangerous, emotionally devastating plan to entirely bypass her own family loyalty and directly contact the deeply frustrated cold case detectives, aggressively actively managing the stagnant Wisconsin investigation. She formally provided the absolutely astounded authorities with a highly comprehensive, meticulously detailed timeline of her father's historical whereabouts, simultaneously volunteering her own biological DNA sample to allow state forensic laboratories to conduct a highly advanced, mathematically definitive comparative analysis against the heavily degraded 1980 crime scene evidence. The absolutely critical, historically monumental breakthrough of the entire decades-long saga successfully materialized when the highly anticipated scientific results confirmed an absolute, mathematically undeniable familial match, directly linking the preserved genetic material to Edward Wayne Edwards and completely verifying his daughter's deeply horrifying suspicions. Armed with this incontrovertible, completely flawless scientific certainty, heavily armed law enforcement units swiftly intercepted the heavily aging, 76-year-old man in his completely unremarkable Kentucky home, abruptly snapping heavy handcuffs onto his wrists. This deeply dramatic, highly publicized apprehension instantly destroyed the carefully constructed, multi-decade facade of normalcy he had successfully maintained, sending massive, unprecedented shockwaves of profound disbelief through his entirely oblivious extended family, and the absolutely astounded true crime community. The stunning, entirely unexpected arrest of Edward Wayne Edwards instantly initiated a massive, deeply emotional legal reckoning, permanently forcing the horrific, heavily suppressed events of his entire adult life directly into the glaringly bright, heavily scrutinized environment of the American judicial system. Confronted with the absolute, mathematically indisputable certainty of the advanced biological profiling, and recognizing the complete futility of maintaining his elaborate lies, the highly arrogant killer rapidly decided to explicitly confess to the Wisconsin and Ohio double homicides, formally pleading guilty to successfully avoid the heavily protracted spectacle of a capital trial. In a deeply horrifying, completely unexpected escalation of his monstrous admissions, Edwards completely shocked seasoned investigators by explicitly confessing to the 1996 completely premeditated murder of his own 25-year-old foster son, Danny Boy Edwards, whom he had mercilessly executed strictly to successfully collect a highly lucrative, fraudulently obtained life insurance policy. The presiding judges explicitly recognized the unimaginable severity of the defendant's completely merciless actions and his decades of deliberate, highly manipulative deception, decisively sentencing the absolutely remorseless predator to multiple consecutive life sentences, heavily guaranteeing he would finally officially expire behind maximum security concrete walls. Edwards ultimately died of entirely natural causes in a prison hospital in 2011, permanently taking his final, pathetic breath just weeks before he was scheduled to formally face the absolute final legal judgment for his Ohio crimes, leaving behind a heavily fragmented legacy of absolute destruction and profoundly shattered trust. For the profoundly traumatized families of his numerous completely innocent victims, the monumental, albeit highly delayed conviction provided a deeply emotional sense of absolute objective closure that heavily validated the incredibly heroic, deeply agonizing sacrifice made by his own brave daughter. The completely devastating reality that a brutal, deeply remorseless serial killer could successfully seamlessly blend into the fabric of everyday American life by intentionally hiding directly behind a fabricated persona of religious redemption served as a profoundly chilling testament to the completely deceptive nature of fundamental human sociopathy. His profoundly dark capability to completely compartmentalize his horrific violence while actively raising a seemingly normal family heavily proved that the most terrifying predators do not always lurk in dark alleys, but frequently sit completely comfortably at the head of a suburban dinner table. This deeply unsettling phenomenon of a completely hidden monster successfully maintaining a mundane, heavily localized professional career while orchestrating a horrific reign of terror directly mirrors the terrifying reality of another highly prolific, heavily compartmentalized killer currently awaiting our absolute final examination. He completely terrorized the chaotic, deeply neon-lit hotel rooms of the East Coast while successfully hiding behind the completely ordinary, highly mundane existence of a married computer operator in New Jersey, forever etching his deeply horrifying moniker into the darkest annals of American true crime. New York City in the late 1960s through the late 1970s was a gritty neon-lit labyrinth of vice, offering absolute anonymity to those who sought to hide their darkest compulsions within the bustling, chaotic streets of the metropolitan area. Amidst this sprawling urban decay, Richard Cottingham completely mastered the terrifying art of living a meticulously compartmentalized double life, presenting a flawless, utterly unremarkable facade to his completely unsuspecting community in suburban New Jersey. To his neighbors, his wife, and his 3 children, he was a highly dependable, hard-working family man who maintained a respectable, well-paying career as a computer operator for a major health insurance company. He perfectly embodied the quintessential daily commuter, wearing a tailored suit and carrying a leather briefcase as he rode the public transit system across the river, blending seamlessly into the massive tide of professionals entering the city each morning. However, when the sun dipped below the towering skyscrapers, his completely ordinary persona entirely evaporated, systematically replaced by a highly predatory, deeply sadistic alter ego that actively prowled the seedy, red light districts for highly vulnerable targets. The sex workers and runaway teenagers who populated the bustling corridors of the city's underbelly were entirely invisible to mainstream society, rendering them the absolute perfect prey for a man who explicitly sought complete domination and absolute physical control. Cottingham exploited their fundamental vulnerabilities with terrifying precision, utilizing his charming, articulate demeanor and the promise of substantial financial compensation to successfully lure them into the private, heavily soundproofed confines of cheap commercial motel rooms. The sprawling, deeply impersonal nature of the massive hospitality industry during this era provided an impenetrable shield of privacy, allowing him to conduct horrific, unspeakable acts of extreme violence without ever raising a single alarm among the transient guests residing just on the other side of the thin walls. His family completely believed his frequent absences and late-night arrivals were simply the resulting byproduct of a highly demanding corporate schedule, utterly blind to the terrifying reality that their primary provider was secretly morphing into one of the most prolific, deeply remorseless predators in the history of the Eastern Seaboard. This profoundly chilling duality seamlessly allowed him to navigate two completely different universes, returning to his quiet suburban home to casually eat breakfast with his innocent children just hours after executing a terrifying, highly calculated slaughter in a completely anonymous hotel room. The terrifying reality of this hidden monster violently breached the public consciousness in December 1979, when an absolutely horrific discovery inside a heavily smoke-filled room at the Travel Inn Motor Hotel near Times Square completely shocked even the most hardened, deeply cynical law enforcement detectives. Firefighters aggressively responding to a routine emergency alarm heavily breached the locked door, instantly discovering a scene of absolute, unrestrained savagery that completely defied the standard parameters of typical urban violence. Inside the burning commercial room lay the bodies of two completely unidentified women who had been mercilessly tortured, brutally murdered, and severely mutilated, with the perpetrator intentionally severing their heads and hands in a highly calculated, deeply successful attempt to permanently thwart forensic identification. This unprecedented, heavily macabre signature instantly signaled to the authorities that they were not dealing with a standard localized homicide, but rather a highly organized, profoundly depraved serial killer who possessed a terrifying degree of anatomical knowledge and operational discipline. The intentional setting of the localized fire clearly demonstrated a highly conscious, deeply methodical effort to completely destroy microscopic biological evidence, heavily indicating that the perpetrator was acutely aware of police investigative procedures and deliberately manipulating the chaotic crime scene to ensure his continued absolute anonymity. The horrific moniker of the Torso Killer was rapidly coined by the deeply terrified local press, instantly igniting a massive wave of paralyzing panic across the entire metropolitan area as residents realized a profoundly unhinged predator was actively utilizing commercial lodging to butcher completely innocent women. When another completely decapitated, heavily mutilated victim was tragically discovered in a New Jersey motel just a few months later, the massive investigation completely crossed state lines, desperately forcing entirely separate police departments to hastily coordinate their heavily overwhelmed resources. This devastating, intensely gruesome, precipitating event officially marked the grim, completely heartbreaking beginning of a frantic, deeply frustrating cat and mouse game between a massive task force and an invisible phantom who continued to seamlessly ride the commuter train to his ordinary office job every single morning. The chilling realization that the killer was actively taking highly recognizable, deeply morbid trophies from his victims permanently elevated the terrifying stakes of the localized manhunt, forcing detectives to aggressively monitor hundreds of transient hotels in a desperate, heavily exhausting attempt to anticipate his next horrific strike. As the brutal, entirely unprovoked killings aggressively escalated into the spring of 1980, the deeply overwhelmed investigators meticulously attempted to construct a viable behavioral profile of the Phantom, heavily relying on the deeply traumatic testimonies of victims who had narrowly survived terrifyingly violent encounters with an affluent, highly articulate client. The localized investigative dragnet aggressively expanded, heavily involving massive undercover stakeouts of specific motels and the widespread distribution of composite sketches that completely failed to capture the completely ordinary, highly unremarkable facial features of the suburban computer operator. Cottingham remained completely unfazed by the massive police presence, heavily saturating his preferred hunting grounds, deeply thriving on the completely sickening psychological thrill of evading detection, while continuing to actively bring his deeply disturbing murder kit into unsuspecting hotel lobbies. This heavy leather bag systematically contained specialized handcuffs, intricate gagging materials, and various industrial restraints, providing him with a completely portable torture chamber that he seamlessly transported beneath the completely oblivious gaze of hotel management and front desk clerks. Detectives aggressively chased down thousands of completely useless public tips, desperately trying to connect the heavily mutilated Jane Does to endless missing persons reports, while simultaneously attempting to seamlessly coordinate vast amounts of circumstantial evidence across deeply divided, highly territorial state and local jurisdictions. The sheer volume of agonizing dead ends created a dense atmosphere of profound professional cynicism among the dedicated task forces, who heavily recognized that the killer's highly transient methodology and completely anonymous victim selection provided an almost impenetrable fortress of operational security. Every single time the heavily armed authorities fundamentally believed they had successfully established a viable geographical perimeter, the predator effortlessly slipped through the massive cracks, continuously masking his deeply horrific weekend atrocities behind the completely mundane, entirely respectable routine of his corporate Monday mornings. The localized panic aggressively intensified as the horrific details of the severe tortures were heavily leaked to the public, forcing hotel managers to aggressively scrutinize their entirely legitimate guests and severely damaging the commercial hospitality industry across the entire region. Despite the absolutely unprecedented scale of the multi-agency manhunt, Cottingham's profound ability to completely compartmentalize his absolute sociopathy allowed him to maintain his pristine, completely unblemished public record, ensuring that his own deeply devoted wife remained entirely oblivious to the heavy leather bag he secretly locked in the trunk of their family car. This deeply agonizing period of profound investigative paralysis completely represented the absolute darkest era of the New York metropolitan tragedy, heavily proving that the most terrifying predators are frequently those who actively master the mundane art of looking entirely like everybody else. The absolute highly dramatic turning point of the entire terrifying saga abruptly materialized in May 1980, completely catalyzed not by a highly complex forensic scientific breakthrough, but by the profoundly courageous, deeply desperate fight for survival from an entirely innocent 18-year-old victim. Cottingham had successfully lured the young woman to a standard room at the Quality Inn in Hasbrouck Heights, New Jersey, rapidly dropping his completely charming fuckhead to violently initiate his highly practiced routine of severe physical torture and absolute psychological domination. However, unlike his previous tragic victims, the young woman fiercely recognized a fleeting, completely microscopic window of opportunity, aggressively fighting back with absolutely everything she possessed and unleashing a series of deeply piercing, highly terrified screams that successfully penetrated the thin motel walls. The profound, incredibly urgent commotion instantly alerted a vigilant housekeeping employee, who immediately contacted the motel management and local authorities, rapidly setting into motion a highly chaotic, breathless police response that completely shattered Cottingham's meticulously maintained operational security. Heavily armed patrol officers arrived at the commercial property with absolute, blazing speed, successfully intercepting the completely panicked, highly disheveled killer as he desperately attempted to rapidly flee down the long, carpeted hallway of the hotel. Upon aggressively apprehending the completely struggling man, deeply stunned investigators meticulously searched his heavy leather bag, instantly discovering an absolute treasure trove of highly terrifying, deeply incriminating evidence, including specialized handcuffs, deeply disturbing personal trophies, and the exact physical implements heavily utilized in the horrific mutilation murders. The absolute shock of discovering that the highly sought, profoundly depraved serial killer was actually a completely unassuming, married computer operator with absolutely no significant criminal record completely fundamentally redefined the parameters of the massive, multi-state investigation. His completely unexpected, highly chaotic capture firmly abruptly ended his horrific, multi-decade reign of absolute terror, violently ripping away the completely fraudulent, highly mundane facade he had successfully utilized to actively deceive his family, his employers, and the entire deeply terrified public. The sudden, incredibly dramatic apprehension officially verified that the invisible phantom violently plaguing the neon-lit streets was finally permanently neutralized, instantly transitioning the massive, heavily active manhunt into one of the most incredibly complex, highly publicized legal proceedings in the history of the Eastern Seaboard. During the heavily scrutinized, incredibly intense criminal trials that officially dominated the early 1980s, the completely remorseless computer operator was definitively convicted of multiple horrific murders, with presiding judges decisively sentencing him to hundreds of years in a maximum security state penitentiary, heavily guaranteeing he would never again walk as a free man. However, the absolute most chilling chapter of his deeply horrifying legacy entirely revolves around the incredibly complex, highly protracted cold case investigations that aggressively continued for several decades after his initial, highly publicized incarceration. Operating with absolute, incredibly patient precision, dedicated cold case detectives spent more than 20 years aggressively cultivating a highly unusual, deeply manipulative report with the deeply narcissistic killer inside his bleak, heavily guarded prison visitation room. Over the course of countless, highly tense interviews spanning nearly 2 decades, relentless investigators successfully managed to carefully extract official, highly detailed confessions to dozens of completely unsolved, heavily archived cold case murders dating all the way back to the late 1960s. These incredibly shocking, highly delayed admissions permanently resolved deeply haunting mysteries like the horrific 1968 murders of completely innocent teenage girls in New Jersey, finally providing a deeply emotional sense of absolute objective closure to completely shattered families who had spent half a century entirely devoid of the truth. The aging, heavily wheelchair-bound inmate systematically admitted to slaughtering up to 100 completely innocent women, actively proving that his horrific tenure as a hidden predator was vastly more expansive and deeply catastrophic than original investigators had ever successfully conceptualized. The incredibly devastating reality that a single, highly compartmentalized man could successfully butcher dozens of innocent people while actively attending parent, teacher meetings and corporate retreats serves as a profoundly chilling testament to the completely deceptive nature of fundamental human sociopathy, as he quietly deteriorates entirely within the bleak, heavily fortified walls of the state penitentiary. His heavily delayed confessions decisively prove that a fiercely dedicated, completely unyielding investigative pursuit can successfully drag the absolute darkest secrets out of the deepest historical shadows. The horrific saga of the Torso Killer perfectly encapsulates the terrifying reality of these multi-decade mysteries, bringing us to a definitive reflection on the profound, deeply unsettling nature of these historical monsters who successfully walked completely untouched among us. These chilling resolutions definitively prove that the most terrifying predators seamlessly hide entirely in plain sight behind the mundane masks of friendly neighbors, leaving us to fundamentally confront one profoundly unsettling question as we close these historical files. How many seemingly ordinary people currently walking among us are still secretly harboring a horrific, decades-old nightmare of their own? Thank you for watching.